In the hospital emergency room, there is a guy lying unconscious on the operating table. He has lost too much blood. Quick, get the blood ready for the transfusion, the surgeon shouted and asked for a clamp. Doctor, the pulse is below average, another doctor answered. As a result of the removal of the metal object, the patient developed an infection. I'm starting CPR, the doctor shouted. If they don't act, the heart will stop. A line appeared on the medical equipment monitor indicating cardiac arrest. The doctor said there was a complete cardiac arrest. One of the doctors said, the patient is no longer... There was a grandmother standing in the corridor to whom they came to give the latest news about the operation. You will save my son, won't you? Please tell him you will save him, she said tearfully. I'm not ready to say goodbye to him yet. He is my only blood, my grandmother continued to cry. Meanwhile, in the operating room, the doctor was preparing to say, death occurred at 22 hours, 49 minutes. The cause of death being external injuries followed by infection, as well as brain death due to excessive bleeding, the doctor stated. The patient's mother continued to sit in the corridor and hope for a better outcome. Suddenly raising her head, she heard someone's footsteps. An unknown doctor was walking towards the operating room. The operation is not over yet, he said. Come on, get to your places quickly. Prepare the protocol and check all the patient's vital signs, the unknown doctor continued confidently. Dr. Lee, please help me transfuse blood faster, he asked. We'll start by checking the removed metal object and at the same time diagnose tetanus. We can still save him, the doctor said, putting on gloves. Meanwhile, two nurses were discussing the point of operating on a dead patient. One told his colleague that he apparently had not heard of this doctor. The nurse noted that this doctor is one of the main authorities in surgery, the one and only who can save even the dead. Hands of God, Shin Yusun. Great job, guys. Dr. Shin praised the other doctors after the surgery. Having bought myself a coffee drink. Taking a sip, Shin Yusung thought that it seemed he wouldn't be able to take advantage of his vacation this time either. I thought I would rest, but today I spent the whole day in the operating room, continuing to think in my thoughts. What a stressful life I have, the guy sighed, looking up. He remembered that he received the nickname Hands of God because he saved even the dead. At first, he wasn't even against it, since the joy of saving patients on the brink of life and death was his motivation. However, patients, having learned of the nickname, flocked to him for help. They even foisted off privileged clients on me and treated me like a medical device that could be used at any time. So he began to think that the nickname Hands of God was even bothering him. Even his colleagues were afraid of him and gradually left. He effectively became an outcast. When was the last time I had time for myself? A guy recalls. Well, it's great that I'm raking in money, Shin thought, but he really doesn't have time to spend it. Thinking that his life had finally gone downhill, the young man decided to cheer himself up with a can of beer and went to get it. While crossing the road in his thoughts, he did not notice the approaching car. Shin Yusun looked at the truck that was getting closer and closer. As they say, before death, your whole life flashes before your eyes? And indeed, various memories began to flash before the guy's eyes, and all of them were in the operating room. The car hit the guy, and he, having lost his bag, already saw the approaching white light. But something went wrong. Ray? Shin heard an unfamiliar voice and didn't understand what was happening or how he hadn't died. Look, he's opening his eyes, the unknown voice continued. What's wrong with my hands? The guy was surprised. His hands were like those of a small child. Ah, he's awake, the unknown girl in front of him exclaimed, continuing to repeat Ray's name. There were two smiling and happy young men standing above the guy. The girl took him in her arms, continuing to admire the baby. And Shin had no idea how he became a little child. I'm absolutely certain I was hit by a truck on my way home from work, right? The guy thought, wondering why he was alive. And who are these people? Honey, Ray's in pain. The strangers were holding the baby in their arms, utterly touched by him. The boy felt how his body looked very small and began to realize that he was reborn as the son of these people. These people look like some kind of cosplayers, the guy continued to think in his mind, looking at everything around. Honey, it seems your daddy has a bit too much stubble, the girl noted, a little worried. Indeed, there were large scratches on the baby's hands. And then the unknown man started screaming, worried about these scratches, and started shouting that they should call a priest to heal him. To which the girl reassured him, saying that she could fix it herself. Does she understand medicine? Shin Yusung thought, wondering if she just applied cream, it might leave scars. And suddenly the young lady waved her hand, and a green light sparkled around the guy's hand. The wound on his arm healed instantly, leaving not even a scar. This isn't medicine, maybe it's magic. Shin was surprised, examining his hand, where the scratch had disappeared. The young people were glad that the baby was okay and healthy. "Look, I told you I could handle it myself," the girl declared proudly, while the man praised her and told her how good she was at magic. Upon hearing the word magic, Shin began to realize that he had been reincarnated in another world. It was a quiet night in the yard. A boy in a child's body lay in a crib looking at the ceiling. "It's been a while since I've slept this long," Shin thought, raising himself a little and looking out the window. 3 months have already passed since his rebirth, and during this time he realized that, firstly, this world is completely different. It is more like a typical fantasy world, where monsters and creatures similar to humans exist. And people often suffer from raids, and therefore, in order to become stronger, they dedicate their lives to the path they have chosen. But what surprised Shin most was that the people of this world decided to develop magic rather than science. Every time the girl named Shin treated him, the boy clearly understood that even in ordinary things they relied on magic. Shin Yusun had already clearly realized that everything around him was not a dream, but reality. And for some reason he was even able to retain memories and knowledge from his past life. Looking out the window, he thought about how long it had been since he had relaxed like this. And now, thinking about it, he realized how, because of work, he had not had the opportunity to enjoy life. And if it weren't for the accident, he would have probably died of exhaustion. But now that he's been reborn, he can kick as much as he wants. One day, when Ray was now asleep and it was night outside, an unknown sound was heard. It was accompanied by a blue color and woke the boy up. It was as if a thin thread was passing through his body, accompanying him with a chill, sign and Isle had once talked about, and it seemed that controlling it wasn't so easy. He assumed that one should focus on the places where the flow of mana begins and ends. Most likely it works the same way as blood. Try to imagine the flow of mana as a bloodstream, Ray urged himself. Focusing once more, endless energy filled his body. A couple of years passed. The golden autumn has given way. The guy had already grown up and was persistently training his strength. Finally, it worked. He marveled, holding in his hand some kind of magical force, red and yellow in color, resembling fire. Ray couldn't even believe that he was starting to succeed. It took him about 3 years to learn how to channel freely flowing mana and cast a fire spell. But even though I understand how mana flows and can remember the direction of its flows, the guy thought, looking at the book, leaning against the bookcase, he didn't understand how to control it from the description in the book. It stated that mana should be stored in the body and used as needed, since mana must be replenished from the environment. The question remained why it was necessary to accumulate it within oneself at all. And everything accumulated limited certain manipulations which sounded ineffective. What if we let the mana flow without trying to contain it, of course? Ray wondered. He wondered if it wouldn't be easier to draw mana from the surrounding environment and use it immediately, which would eliminate the need for mana circles. Of course, the guy calculated all the risks and considered this method quite dangerous, but he still wanted to try it. He couldn't even imagine that the result of working with magic would exceed all his expectations. Look, Ray grabs books at the first opportunity. He's so wonderful, I can hardly contain myself, Shin exclaimed, looking at her son. She watched with Ale and discussed how he would become a good magician, while Ale himself said that with his physique, he should become a swordsman. If that happens, our cutie Ray will turn into a blockhead just like you, Shin declared, to which Isle, of course, disagreed, noting that at least he was a cute blockhead. Ray continued reading his book, amused by why his parents were hiding from him when they were making so much noise anyway. Shin asked her husband with concern. She was worried that children his age usually went out and played with friends, rather than sitting with books all day. Ale immediately calmed his wife down, arguing that many parents couldn't even get their children to sit down with books, and that it wasn't she who wanted to raise a wonderful magician. The girl was still alarmed by how stubbornly and for how long their son sat over books. This is not enough, Ray, sitting with the book, understood that he wanted more in magic. He confidently wanted to chart the perfect direction for the mana flow himself, as accurately as possible. It was a warm, sunny day with a beautiful blue and slightly cloudy sky. "Is our cutie Ray here?" Shin blurted out excitedly as she burst into the room. Seeing her son immersed in a world of books, Shin felt anxious again. Of course, she was glad that he was interested in books, but she really wanted the boy to play and be friends with his peers. Perhaps she wanted this so much because, as a child, she herself did not have the opportunity to communicate with other children. Ray looked up from his reading and looked at his mother in surprise, who was worried about something. She was definitely very worried about something. "Ray, do you want to play with me today?" Shin asked with a bright smile on her face. The boy's face immediately lit up. He was already happy that his mother would teach him the basics of magic. "Yes, let's play," Ray exclaimed, his eyes shining with joy, already anticipating magic lessons. Shin looked at her son, surprised by such a violent reaction. The girl hugged her son tightly. She was pleased to see such a reaction to the offer to go for a walk. Why hadn't she asked this before? It seems that everything did not go according to plan for the boy. He was standing with his mother near the door to the street. "Well, you won't need books, we're going outside today," Shin declared solemnly, pointing to the front door. Ray ironically went the other way. He can't waste his time on games. He needs to practice more. The boy's mother was very proud of her son, as he devoted so much time to books and studying. "But today you really should take a break," Shin stated softly, placing her hands on the boy's shoulders. Ray looked at his mother with a little disappointment and confusion, but he still realized that he had not gone outside since his rebirth. He didn't even have any idea what this world looked like. "Okay, let's go out and play a little," the boy exhaled. "One day of rest will definitely be enough." "Great, then hurry up," Mom said enthusiastically. Stepping outside and seeing the world for the first time in several years, the boy's face lit up with great surprise. A bright and colorful town appeared before him, with low houses whose roofs were decorated with intricate elements, and green trees planted along the roads created a more cozy atmosphere. For 3 years, Ray spent at home reading books, immersing himself in the vast knowledge of this world, not even thinking about leaving the house. And when Ray saw this city for the first time, he felt a sense of peace, and the place itself was imbued with a cozy charm. The boy realized that he had effectively locked himself in a cage. "Ray, what are you thinking about?" Shin asked, observing her son's surprise and fascination with the world. Mom suggested taking a look around a bit. The boy's foot stepped onto the soft ground covered with grass. Ray seemed to take off, tearing off from his place and running. Happiness filled the boy, and he rushed forward as if freed from all worries. The boy ran across the meadow as if on a fairy tale carpet. The grass, covered with flowers, shimmered in the sunlight with various colors of the rainbow. It was a feeling of magic. The world stopped to admire it. A deep lake with unusually clear turquoise water appeared before the boy, and steep rocky banks, densely overgrown with pine forest, surrounded the reservoir on both sides. Ray's face was covered with unimaginable surprise at what he saw. Before his reincarnation, he had no way to take care of himself, living under constant pressure. He existed rather than lived, but now he had never felt so free. "However, I am so glad that I was born into this world," the boy exclaimed in his thoughts. "Mom!" the boy called out to Shin, and turning to her with a slight smile and happy eyes, he thanked his mother for taking him for a walk. "Urgent patient, take him to the operating room immediately." Ray recalled his life spent with patients all day, how he carried out operation after operation so that there was no time even for rest. He was so tired that he had no strength left to endure this chaos. "Ray?" a female voice was heard through the child's sleep. "It's gastric tachycardia," the boy screamed, waking abruptly from a nightmare about his former life. "Did you have a bad dream?" the mother asked, stroking her son's head and trying to calm him down. Ray reluctantly opened his eyes, the bright sun illuminating his face. Waking up from sleep and turning my head in front of him, the town stood like an illustration from a fairy tale. The houses, painted in warm brown-beige tones, seemed cozy and welcoming. The sunlight breaking through the haze, enveloping the town in a gentle, soft glow, giving it a magical fairy tale look. Ray fully realized the reality of his rebirth into this wonderful world. He felt completely rested and ready to live life, and he firmly decided that his life in this world would be strikingly different from the previous one. Ray lived with his family in a small, cozy house with a small flower garden in the backyard. "We're back!" Shin cried joyfully, discussing with her husband what a wonderful walk they had had. The boy slowly approached his mother. "Mom," Ray began, tugging her skirt slightly to get her attention, and with bright and joy-filled eyes he asked to be taught magic. "Oh my God!" Shin looked at her son in amazement, covering her face with her hands. And falling on Ayla, she began to be touched by how Ray could be so sweet. "You're already interested in magic, of course. Mom will teach you." The girl agreed with a smile on her face. The boy's face lit up with satisfaction. He was still having a hard time getting used to his parents' reaction. Since Ray himself asked, "We can start right now," Shin said with undisguised joy. "Fire!" And with a flick of the wrist, a torrent of magic erupted from the girl. "Wow!" Ray watched his mother with admiration. Shin was surprised by his reaction, thinking that he was not interested. "It's fire, aren't you curious?" Shin, expecting admiring glances, was surprised to see her son simply standing there, so surprised he couldn't say a word. The boy had already used this magic and he wanted more. "Let's sit down," the girl suggested, about to begin talking about magic. "The thing is, there is a certain peculiarity," Sen began. She explained that the magic we want to use is converted into mana through a spell and an action. That's it, easy, right? The girl asked, simultaneously demonstrating the fire magic in her hand. Mom, I have a question. Ray had been wanting to know what had been intriguing him for a long time. Is it possible to transform mana in another way? This question took Sane by surprise. Take fire, for example. The boy tried to explain his idea in detail. First you compress mana, then you collect it, and you apply the force of friction. Instead of 3 mana transformations, wouldn't it be easier to do it once? Although, if you do that, the mana will dissipate faster, the boy continued to reason. This question from her son put Shin in a difficult position, as she did not know how to answer it. She seriously thought about it. Was it really possible? She thought about this idea. If 3 events grouped together stabilize, then everything will work out, said Sane. True, she did not test this in practice and assumed it purely theoretically. The boy plunged into deep thought, pondering the information he had received. Stabilization, does that mean? Ray thought, clenching his fist. What is in a completed state? Can we add more attributes? The boy summoned all his strength and concentrated, and suddenly his palm began to sparkle, energy accumulating in it as if recognizing the direction of his actions. A powerful stream of scarlet flame burst from the child's palm, coloring the air orange-red, illuminating everything around with a gentle but burning light. And Sane, seeing this, was deeply shocked. I did it! Ray exclaimed with joy, not believing his eyes that he had finally managed to implement his theory. Then Eel suddenly ran into the room, hearing a strange sound and the boy's cries asking what it was. Sane was wildly surprised that she couldn't even explain what was happening to her husband. She didn't even notice the moment when her son used magic. After all, when using magic, there is always a flow of mana that needs to be controlled. Ray remembered his life where he was constantly with patients and was constantly tired, but he didn't even feel this magic. It turns out that it was much easier for him to understand by imagining it as an atom, and when combined as a compound, there is no longer any need to introduce mana. While he was thinking, he didn't even hear his worried and astonished parents. Oh no, was I concentrating too much? The boy looked at his mother. Mom, what happened? Shin was very proud that Ray could use magic. I think I'm a genius. The boy was sure of it. His mother was very proud of him. That same night, when the boy fell asleep, the parents decided to talk about today. This is a serious problem, Ray heard through his sleep, opening his eyes. What should we do if the academy finds out about him? Sane and Isle discussed anxiously, wanting to protect their child. Ray, already fully awake, realized that they were talking about him. Ray is a genius, the kind that are born every 100, no 1,000 years, his parents whispered. What if he attracts academies? What will happen then? The boy didn't know what academy his parents were talking about, but he assumed that he might be drawn there because of his abilities. Whatever happens, I need strength, Ray thought confidently. Previously, he wanted to learn it for fun, but after changing his mind, he became eager to gain absolute power. It was a warm, sunny day, illuminating every branch of the trees. The little house looked especially cozy, surrounded by birdsong in the bright sunlight. Someone was sleeping in the room, making a characteristic snoring sound. The fair-haired young man jumped up, awakened by the rays of the sun streaming through the window. The guy looked out the window. Is it morning already? Since I am a hermit in bed, I cannot say how time passes, the boy reasoned, scratching his head. And fully awake, an idea struck him. So, should I take the risk? Ray, now 15, exclaimed questioningly. His experiments and research into increasing the level of magic and his genius understanding of mana, they became the basis for its extremely rapid development. Due to the massive amount of mana he absorbed, his hair turned pure white. Right, I need to take this with me. Ray held up a sign with the phrase, I can cure those who are sick. Perhaps he would need some medical knowledge. It's worth a try, Ray declared decisively. Before leaving, the guy sighed slightly, decided to test all his magical powers one last time, and made a slight movement of his hand. And 3 elements began to appear one after another, the first of which was a blazing fire with tongues of flame of various colors. Further, eddies of wind appeared from the boy's hand, visible as transparent streams. And at the end of testing their powers, ice appeared, forming ice crystals. The guy finished it all off with a bright flash of his fingers. Excellent, he declared proudly. That's it, we have to go. Ray went to the square in the town. Today was the most sunny and warm day. Having decided on the location, he carefully placed his sign. It seemed like a suitable place. The guy stood on a busy street. He, a little embarrassed, cleared his throat slightly and prepared to give the call. I can cure anyone who's feeling ill. Take any patient here, Ray shouted across the street, calling the crowd together. But the residents, looking at the young man's age, were only touched by what a pleasant young man he was. They laughed and shouted at him to go home and that he shouldn't mock sick people like that. Ray expressed his indignation. He didn't like the fact that these people were allowing them to judge him. Although I expected something like this, the guy needed to calm down. But he felt his anxiety growing, and the excitement was gradually consuming him. I can't believe no one came, Ray screamed, falling to his knees in despair. He thought that there was definitely nothing to do here today and he should go back home, but suddenly a silhouette appeared. Can you really heal the sick? The boy looked up, hearing someone's voice. Anyone? A young girl dressed in a green and white dress stood before him. Ray wondered if this was his first patient. So, can you do it? The young lady asked, now with increasing interest, to which the young man replied that he needed to examine the patient first. The girl with a displeased face looked at him with a little anger, and she started screaming that such an idiot could not heal a sick person. Ray was indignant at what he heard. Hey, Shorty, he called out to the girl. What, Shorty? These words made her very angry. Even though I looked like a useless 15-year-old boy, he was very confident in his words. But there's no one I wouldn't help. Ray put his hand on his chest, declaring that it was time to stop judging by appearances alone. The girl, looking at the guy, was once again convinced that he was very young. But for some reason, I was confident in him. You're right, I'm sorry, the lady apologized, coming closer. Allow me to introduce myself formally. I am the only daughter of Viscount Hade von Elich. The girl made a slight curtsy, holding the edge of her skirt on both sides. Ray introduced himself and looked at her. Assuming that she was a noblewoman, this was evident from her clothes. Alika was not happy with the guy switching to formal speech and asked him to speak as before. She began her story by saying that the patient who needed to be cured was her father. Recently, the skin on his chest turned red and lumps appeared. All of it swelled up like balls. The girl's face became very sad. Ray's first thought was, "Can I have a look at it?" The guy asked. It was an emergency and every second counted. The main thing is that it is not a tumor the size of a ball. And the two of them ran, hoping that the main thing was not that it would be too late. Having reached the house, the boys stopped near the fence that enclosed the garden and the house. Come on in. In front of the guy stood a large, luxurious house with an equally large area and a fountain in front of the house. As soon as they entered, they saw the butler. My lady, you have returned. Elika ran up to the butler asking how her father was. My lady, his condition suddenly worsened and he died, he replied. This is a lie! The girl's face began to fill with tears. She didn't want to believe what was happening. And Alika ran very quickly to her father's room, hoping that the rumors were just rumors. As the lady ran down the corridor of the mansion, a thin thread of hope flickered in her soul, clinging to the thought that this was all a lie. Bursting into the room, the girl shouted, Father! In front of her sat a tearful mother, and next to her on the bed lay a pale father with his eyes closed and those same black balls on his chest. No, father, please! Elika threw herself at the bed, letting out a piercing cry of utter despair. Ray, who was present at this, also came closer, his face serious and focused. He began to examine the black balls in detail, studying their structure. They seemed to have attached themselves to the man's chest, tightly clinging to his flesh. Concentrating, Ray used his magic, checking for subtle signs of life, and he firmly declared, he can survive. The tearful mother and butler looked at the young man in surprise. It seemed there was no hope left. Ray, Elika said quietly, gently tugging at the hem of her dress. Please, save him. The girl's face was covered in tears and disappointment, and her voice was full of pleading and despair. The guy grinned, looked at the lady and said only one comforting word. Don't worry. His voice was calm, but inside he was already ready for action. Who is this boy? Quite a few people had gathered in the room, discussing how anyone could have let a commoner into the estate. The butler explained that the young man had promised to save the dying man, but there were those who thought he was an ordinary swindler and thief. It doesn't matter now. I just want to cling to my last hope, said Alika's mother, collecting her tears with a handkerchief. She hoped that perhaps this child would perform a miracle. Her hope was great. Meanwhile, Ray was dealing with the man. The balls stuck to him were filled with black pus. He decided to first concentrate his mana and form a scalpel out of it. And soon a completely real, albeit magical instrument was shining on his finger. But those in the room didn't like what the boy was doing at all. What are you doing? One of the servants barked, ready to pounce on the young man. A sharp scream deafened Ray, knocking him out of his state of concentration. He instinctively covered his ears, trying to block out the noise. I'm trying to cure him, the boy declared, looking around at everyone. But the Viscount's servants were furious that the boy could treat their master like that. "If you don't trust me, I can drop everything and just leave." Without any questions at all, the guy had already started to get up. His patience was running out. Elika's mother intervened, screaming loudly and stopping the escalating brawl. "Let's just trust this child," the woman said in a calm but firm voice. There, stop shouting and come out. You're in the way," Ray said, pointing to the door. In his thoughts, he analyzed the situation. That as soon as he made the cut, pus began to flow instead of blood. It could have been not just a tumor, but something much more serious, causing great danger to the patient. The boy realized that it was skin that had undergone necrosis due to poison. He began to accumulate magical energy, focusing on his inner source of power. The air around him sparkled. Ray rolled up his sleeves and began to treat the man. "Let's get started," he said, forming a shiny magical scalpel on the tip of his finger. First, it was necessary to get rid of the parts affected by pus, and the young man carefully began to cut off the black purulent balls. All this time they stood in the room and watched. Alika looked at what was happening in horror. Then an incision had to be made on the side of the chest. Seeing what was inside, Ray stopped. "As I thought, his lungs have already begun to decompose," the guy thought, assessing the scale of the damage. "How advanced is the disease?" In a way, the man was even lucky, Ray thought, continuing to work. The part with necrosis was not that big, and if it was cut out, the gentleman had every chance of recovering quickly. The guy used magic to create thin but strong threads, imitating surgical suture material. And like an experienced surgeon, he began to skillfully suture each incision with precise movements. At this point, the room was plunged into silent anticipation, each person present following the developments with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The boy that the young lady brought in did incredible things for those around him, amazing them with his skills. "I'm simply speechless," the butler said quietly, watching the miracle. He was amazed not only by the charisma with which the boy carried himself, which was unusual for a teenager, but also by his virtuoso use of his hands. Ray used magic to transform his hands into surgical instruments, using them with incredible precision. His movements were fast and confident. "I'll finish by putting in stitches," the guy said, each of his fingers wrapped in a gossamer thin thread of magical energy. And he carefully moved the needle, stitching up the man's wounds with thin thread. He was like a puppeteer, skillfully controlling the subtle threads of fate, restoring the Viscount's life. In the eyes of others, Ray looked like a god as he performed the delicate work of the healing ritual. "This boy can really perform a miracle for us," the butler said hopefully. The maid, looking at the boy, was also amazed by his skills. "Indeed," she replied. "Great, we're almost done," Ray sighed, rubbing his tired head. He stitched up all of the man's incisions, and all that remained was to restore blood circulation. And using his mana, the guy created an energetic imitation of a defibrillator. Hoping to restart the heart, Ray made a motion with his hands on the man's chest, penetrating the body with energy and trying to revive him. He repeated this procedure twice, focusing on his goal. And on the third try, the heart finally started beating. "It worked! He's alive!" Ray exclaimed with joy and satisfaction at his accomplishments, his mood triumphant. "The operation was a success," he said with a smile, turning to the others, expecting gratitude and praise. But everyone in the room looked at the boy with great shock and hidden anger. "Why are they looking at me like that?" Ray didn't understand why everyone was unhappy, and his joy quickly turned to confusion. And looking at the man, I realized that blood was coming out of his mouth when the guy was restoring blood flow to the dead body. "You brat!" the captain yelled with great anger. "I knew it!" He pointed his finger at him, continuing to shout what a fraud he was. Ray started trying to explain everything, but no one even wanted to listen to him. "But the Viscount is alive!" The boy tried to convince him, but the captain's scream was too loud. "Where is he alive? All I see is a bloody body!" The captain's voice rose to a furious roar. "Don't worry, he's really alive," Ray continued to explain, but his words still went unheard. "Wait a minute." Alika didn't let the guy finish speaking. "Ray, you said you could save him," she said, lowering her head with a dejected look. Alika's rage burst out in a piercing scream. "I believed you!" Ray was desperately trying to convince everyone of the operation's success. "Just look at him," he shouted, gesturing towards the Viscount. "My father died because I brought you here." Tears streamed down the lady's cheeks and her eyes filled with bitterness. "He really is completely cured. You just need to wait a little," the guy explained, not understanding the behavior of those around him. Perhaps they behaved this way because they had never seen operations. Suddenly, as if out of nowhere, the captain's blade appeared in front of Ray's face, raised to strike. This was very unexpected. He took the guy's words as an attempt to seduce the young lady. "I've done enough already defiling the Viscount's body," he screamed, and several armored knights burst into the room ready for battle. The young man stood looking at the blade next to him with incomprehension. "I spent so much effort to save him," Ray said indignantly. "But not only did you not receive gratitude, you also pointed a sword at me," the guy blurted out, his patience snapping. "What did you say there? That I'm a fraud and a murderer?" He stood up confidently, and his eyes filled with anger. "You've messed with the wrong person," the young man addressed everyone. Ray remembered the norms of this world, and this was rather an expected reaction. "I repeat, the treatment was successful," the young man firmly stated. "Wait and see the improvements, and I'm leaving." Ray headed towards the exit. "And I warn you, please don't stand in my way," the guy warned firmly, throwing an angry look. The captain, baring his teeth, looked like an enraged beast, his face distorted with anger and a thirst for revenge. And swinging his sword, he shouted, "Arrogant!" Ray stood with his back to him and already felt that they were advancing on him. The captain was about to strike the boy, but Ray reacted instantly, a magic chain entangling the captain's hands. "Mana capture!" The man couldn't believe his eyes. He could use such magic? The other soldiers stood to the side. "What are you standing there for? Grab him immediately," the commander shouted, still standing motionless. He was sure that the guy wouldn't be able to block several at once, but he didn't understand the scale of his power. "Capture!" Ray shouted the spell, putting his hand forward, and the transparent chain wrapped around the rest of the soldiers. "Double magic?" the captain stuttered, his eyes wide with surprise. Ray's body was enveloped in blue magic, his gaze conveying complete confidence. This was the last warning. The soldiers began to fall in convulsions, struck by magic. "Don't try to stop me," said the young man, and headed for the exit, leaving behind a scene of defeat. When he came out, it was already evening, and the dark sky was strewn with millions of twinkling stars. It doesn't matter how big the difference in the level of development of medicine is, the guy thought, as he walked along the dark street. They go too far. As Ray walked home, he thought how offensive it was that he was treated like a child or a fraud. However, today, he had his first patient in this world. Although he had little medical skills, when he arrived home, his worried mother was already waiting for him. "Ray, are you late?" Her voice was full of worry and anger. The guy was so deep in thought that he simply lost sight of time. His thoughts were far from home. "What time did Mom ask you to come home?" Shin stood there, looking at her son with undisguised indignation. "Do you know how many evil people there are in the world? You're being punished, under house arrest for 2 days." The boy's mother was very strict, but she still worried. Ray stood silently, looking down, almost betraying indifference and displeasure. Wherever he was treated like a child. At the same time, passions were running high in the Vi country, and discussions continued about what had happened. What was that? Who was this child? The captain was in complete shock, and suddenly Alika screamed, "Father!" The man lying on the bed took a sharp breath. His chest rose and he coughed several times. Alika and her mother were stunned with surprise at seeing the Viscount alive, their faces expressing a mixture of surprise and disbelief. "The Viscount is alive!" The captain froze, his eyes wide. "How is this possible?" Everyone stood there, not knowing what emotion to use, but for the most part, everyone was in deep shock. Alika began to remember the words she had spoken to Ray, how she had been rude to him, accusing him of his father's death, how they threatened him with swords, calling him a bastard and a fraud. Many people felt a little ashamed of what they said or did to this guy. "It seems we made a huge mistake. We failed to recognize our savior." Alika's mother was the first to start talking about this, expressing regret and remorse. And turning to the captain, she ordered him to find the boy immediately, since this event casts a shadow on the honor of the family. The captain, however, was reluctant to accept this order. Meeting Ray frightened him. After seeing the magic and power of this guy, he felt a hidden fear. "Also apologize for your rudeness," the lady said sharply, to which the captain was completely taken aback. Meanwhile, the butler wondered out loud how such a small boy could perform such an amazing miracle. Is he really a saint? Everyone froze when they heard this word. No one has ever heard of saints using magic. The Viscount's face was very peaceful. Everyone saw how he was coming to his senses. If it wasn't a saint who raised the dead, then who was? The captain wondered, turning to everyone else in the room, equally astonished. And who are the saints? They were chosen by God himself and possessed enormous divine power, could hear his voice and were generally God's favorites and trusted persons. But hadn't this child heard that there was a saint in the kingdom? The lady mused. It was entirely possible that no one knew about him yet. Apart from the Viscount's illness, which even the priest could not cure, Everyone was sure that the man who cured him was a saint. Then if he's a saint, what have you done, Commander? The butler snapped, to which the captain immediately began apologizing for his ignorance and for casting aspersions on the Viscount. Alika's mother immediately started saying it was everyone's fault, because everyone was standing by and watching. Let's meet Ray, no, the saint, and apologize. Alika added, What are you talking about? A man's voice came from the bed, his voice breaking the tension in the room. Did you say saint? The Viscount asked, not understanding what you meant, rising to a sitting position. I ask what the hell happened? His daughter began to tell how a saint came and cured him. So, I woke up because of the saint? The man asked, clenching his fist. And why the hell are you standing there discussing your outrageous rudeness? He raised his voice, addressing the commander. The Viscount continued to shout how dare they and ordered them to stop the fuss. Connect everyone in this mansion and use any means necessary, but find him, the man confidently ordered. Immediately, he added, shouting impatiently. At this time, Ray was sitting, reading a book and lazily scratching his ear. Who's remembering me there? Flashed through his thoughts. Because itching ears means that someone is remembering you. On a sunny day, Ray and his mother went to the forest, at the edge of which stood lush green trees, and between them dense bushes flaunted. Good luck, Ray, Shin exclaimed, happy for her son. Ray held his wand in his hand and prepared to cast a healing spell. He shouted, pointing his hand at the twig. But he didn't succeed. The stick remained broken. At this time, Shin was touched by her son's actions. God, you're so cute. Her eyes shone with love and pride. Fire! A bright stream of fire flared up at the tip of the boy's finger like a small sun. It was really easy for him. The young man tried again to use the new spell, healing. This time the branch also turned out to be broken, and the magic refused to respond to his call. Ray was upset. Why wasn't it working? Wait, let me explain. Listen carefully. Shin offered her help. Healing is a spell that uses mana to increase the vitality of your target. The guy had a hard time grasping it. Imagine using mana to create a layer around the target. Shin pointed her hand at the branch, and the stick instantly bonded itself at the breakpoint. At the junction, a soft blue light shone, indicating the action of magic. The girl, having convinced her son that it was not very difficult, asked him to try to use this spell again. Suddenly, a rustling sound was heard from the trees. Ray and Shin stopped, listening to the sounds. A beautiful animal emerged from behind the trees. Oh, it's a deer, Shin exclaimed. His leg was injured at the bend, and a small amount of blood was leaking from it. Great, why don't you try healing a deer? Shin suggested practicing on an animal. Ray thought about what a practical task would be. It would still be beneficial to him, hoping for a greater result than from training on the branch. Shin advised him to slowly approach the deer and, most importantly, not to worry. Ray concentrated, trying to breathe evenly, and he began to take it step by step, trying not to frighten the wounded animal. The deer raised its muzzle, looking attentively at the young man. Its ears were raised alertly, sensing the presence of a man, and the frightened animal darted toward the forest. He's running away, Ray shouted, watching as it disappeared into the depths of the green thicket. Shin thought, which surprised the guy greatly. As he ran after the deer, he wondered why he had to do this at all. How significant was it that the hand of God had exerted such effort to heal? Ray ran so fast that all the leaves beneath his feet began to swirl in a whirlwind. Of course, he wanted to do everything to save as many lives as possible. The guy continued to think as he ran after the deer. He remembered what happened in the Viscount's house, simultaneously using magic and pulled a transparent chain from his hand to stop the deer. The people here needed knowledge of modern medicine. They are only afraid because of the uncertainty. Caught! The animal was caught in the magical chains and stopped, still kicking for freedom. Still, the deer ran too fast. Despite the injured leg, Ray was surprised by the deer's endurance. It's not evening yet, we'll patch you up now, the guy said with a smile on his face, stroking the frightened animal to calm it down. If magic is what they're using, I'll do everything I can to make it work. Ray braced himself and began gathering mana, a blue-green light sparkling around him. Shin's mouth opened in surprise. This is incredible mana, but how? She whispered, stopping dead in her tracks. Ray, gathering all his strength into a fist, aimed it at the deer. My honor as a doctor says always take the next step, the young man thought to himself, and shouting a spell, heal, he released a powerful ball of magical energy, enveloping the animal in blue light. The deer made a piercing sound and fell to the ground, its body going limp. Ray moved closer to him, starting to check for signs of life. Shin stood watching the lying deer. She couldn't understand what had happened. And realizing that the deer wasn't breathing, both of them froze in place, their eyes wide in surprise. "Oh my God, he died instantly!" The boy screamed, not understanding why this had happened, even though his action should have actually healed him. "A doctor who can't save," Ray whispered desperately, lowering his head towards the deer. He began to remember Shin's words that, using mana to reduce the layer in order to increase vitality, he compared his mother's words. Why didn't he understand how to heal but could use other magic? He had the path of mana, and if he used healing on a person, this would not end well. Ray realized that his abilities needed further study. For now, he had to stay away from healing magic, Ray thought. He couldn't risk the lives of others. The forest became silent again. Only the wind and falling leaves could be heard. Day turned to evening. The boy and his mother returned home, tired, but full of thoughts. The family had a delicious, juicy steak for dinner today, which made the guy think that this day was somehow special. Oh, speaking of which, Sane turned to Isle, laughing a little. "What, our brilliant son can't heal?" The father laughed, finding it all cute. Both parents laughed and continued to say what a sweet son they had, which made Ray very angry. "I'll never learn healing magic again," he thought sharply to himself. At this time, in the Holy Empire of Gaia, there stood a majestic and mysterious palace. Its light, polished marble, its facade lined with graceful straight lines, radiating calm and nobility. In the very heart of the palace stood a female sculpture of Aya, adorned with a golden wreath, giving her the appearance of a heavenly queen. The monarch, the Pope of the Holy Empire, humbly knelt before her, expressing deep respect and humility before the divine essence. "My lady calls me?" the Pope said, gazing at the sculpture. "Find him." Aya's voice sounded like thunder in the silence of the hall. "Find a new gray-haired constellation," she declared, and as if by magic, the shining silhouette of a boy appeared before her. A group of knights in shining armor moved slowly along the road. In front of them walked a man with a cloth in his hands, on which was depicted a symbol, and the whole group was led by a leader on a horse. The knights were discussing a new saint, because they already had one, and then a new young saint appeared. This phenomenon was not the first in history, and it was even good that there would be another one, the saint discussed the walkers. 10 hours before the contingent was dispatched, a conversation took place in the Holy Empire of Gaia. My lady at last," the Pope exclaimed, rushing across the hall towards the goddess. Thank you, my lady." He fell to his knees, raising his arms to the sides. He asked what task was destined for him. "Find the white-haired saint in the land known as Cilia," declared the stone goddess, shining in all her glory, a golden vine hanging around her dress, glittering and wondrous. "Is that all?" The man was clearly perplexed by the meager information about who he needed to find. "In Cilia who have gray hair," the man said, hoping for a few more clues. "The new saint is not old. Find him and bring him to the Holy Empire." The goddess seemed to glow even more brightly. "Yes, my lady, I will certainly find him," the Pope of the Holy Empire blurted out, feigning excitement on his face. He called to one of his servants. "Irene, are you here?" A red-haired young guy ran up to him. "Prepare the delegation. We're heading to Cilia," the man quickly ordered, urging the young man on. But on his face one could see excitement and fear because of the new saint, and a young one at that. "Ray!" The boy sat with his glasses on, reading a book, before his father called him. "How about learning the swords of courage?" I'll asked the boy. "The more ways you know to protect yourself, the better," Ray thought about the offer. After all, if you think about it, it's true compared to his past life, where he could get everything he needed with ease. In this world, you have to risk your life for every apple. "Okay, I want to try to learn," the guy agreed, closing the book. I'll suggested starting right now. And while they were walking, his father asked Ray why he wore glasses, to which he replied that it was just a habit. Taking up their swords, they began to train and fight with swords that glittered in the rays of the sun, and the atmosphere became filled with tension. "Pretty good for a first time," the man praised his son, admiring his skill. However, Ray had studied the martial art of kendo in his previous life, and this reflected in his skills in this world. Both fought so skillfully and quickly that due to the speed, each could have been left with several blows. A new idea flashed through Ray's mind, one that could change the course of the training. He gripped the hilt of his sword tightly. Isle, watching his son, did not understand his plans. His face expressed slight confusion. "Are you giving up already?" he asked, stopping his onslaught. Ray began to focus his mana, and his body began to glow with a gentle blue light, as if enveloping him in an aura. Magic surrounded his sword, creating a protective shell. The guy grinned, feeling a surge of strength and took a fighting stance. It was the aura of the sword. And running towards his opponent in the form of his father, he struck. It should work, he thought in his mind, reflecting the attacks and making precise movements. If this continues, I will lose. The last attack pushed Ale a short distance away. So I have no choice. The man began to use magic himself, his sword glowing bright red, as if it had transformed into a fiery blade. We must use the aura, he said, and prepared to deliver the decisive blow. Ray looked at his father with inspired eyes. Ale delivered a powerful blow, full of magical power, his sword piercing the air with a roaring whistle. The sword in Ray's hand trembled from the force of the blow and began to slip, breaking free from his grip. The guy flew backwards from the magical shockwave. He landed straight in a sitting position, feeling a little painful and uncomfortable. Ale ran to his son, worried that he had hit him too hard and could have harmed the boy. The city had a bustling market where they sold fresh vegetables, fruits, and other goods necessary for residents. Local residents began to notice an unusual number of people in guild robes wandering around the city, their appearance causing alarm and speculation. A man with dark hair and a hooded cape stood in front of the counter. His face was not visible. He moved purposefully towards a certain place. "Did you get anything?" The question was addressed to a group of men in street clothes. They replied that it was difficult to find a person knowing only their age and hair color. They were always asked every day. The dark-haired guy from the guild began to notice sidelong glances. "Did you guys find anything?" he asked, still wearing his cape and patiently awaiting an answer. "Look here, Mr. Knight, finding a needle in a haystack is easier? A 15-year-old gray-haired boy? How are we supposed to find him, knowing only this?" One of the boys growled, their voices filled with irritation and weariness from the fruitless search. The guild knight gritted his teeth and held back a surge of anger. He felt irritated. "You say you haven't found anything yet, then what the hell are you doing?" He shouted at the guys and went to see Monsieur Viscount. "You guys think he's a normal guy?" The Viscount's voice cut through the air, his words full of impatience and anxiety, and he glared at the captain. He continued to shout that this boy was a saint, and if he was not found, the consequences would be dire. "There will be war. The Holy Empire could declare war on us." The master continued shouting, "If you don't want our family destroyed, find him now." The captain tried not to show any excitement. In the house, they were ready to pay any amount for the necessary information. "Did you just say any amount of money?" A voice came from the darkness, a silhouette approaching the captain. "Then I will help you." A guy in the most ordinary clothes sat in front of him and smiled slightly. He had straight, carelessly flowing brown hair and a pretty face with kind but advantage-seeking eyes. His confidence knew no bounds. Meanwhile, Ray, after the fall, examined the wounds on his hand from the slipped sword. Isle immediately rushed to his son to apologize for hitting him too hard. But Ray, surprisingly, did not show any offense. "Ray, what's wrong with your hand?" Shin screamed, her eyes wide with fear. Running up to her son and examining him, she realized that he had a broken bone. But it wasn't scary because the arm could be healed with magic. "I want to try it myself," the guy replied. Isle still felt sorry for what happened. Healing. Ray's wound after the spell began to be covered with green light. The parents watched in delight as their son was finally able to use healing magic, their faces expressing both surprise and pride. Oh, San sighed, surprised again by her abilities. The wound on his arm quickly healed, leaving no trace, as if the cut had never been there. The parents began to discuss how he managed to do it. Last time he killed a deer, which, by the way, made a delicious dinner. Sen recalled a recent day. Ray realized that it was time to reveal his secret. He felt he had to tell his parents. "Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something," the guy began to say. "I'm not really like other people." Ray paused, lowering his head and feeling tense, waiting for a reaction. There was deathly silence for several seconds. And then Sane and Isle started laughing. Their laughter was embarrassed and a little awkward. They didn't understand what their son wanted to say. "Ray, Mom and Dad will always support you." The boy realized they hadn't understood the true meaning of the words. They began to say that they would always love him, and that even if he brought an orc's wife, he would remain their beloved son, as long as he was happy. That same day, already at home, Ray's conversation continued. He explained that instead of using a circle to store mana within bodies, he uses an endless stream of pure mana naturally formed through the vessels. Since pure mana is much stronger than purified mana, I understand why Ray's magic is so strong, Sien thought, reflecting on her son's words. So the guy, using healing on someone who couldn't withstand the flow of pure mana, could die. Just like it was with the deer. "Son, I know you're a genius, but using our family's secret techniques?" Sin thought that the boy shouldn't use such magic. Ray thought that he really couldn't use his magic to heal ordinary people. He needed to think about what to do in the future if he wanted to heal people. His parents stood there looking anxious as they pondered the unexpected news. "It's worth gaining surgical experience," flashed through the boy's mind like a sudden flash of insight. "I'll be back soon," the young man shouted, looking at his parents. And when his father asked him where he was going, he replied that he wanted to skip school. He couldn't say that he was going to have surgery. "Don't go anywhere with strangers, got it?" Shin threatened her son. Kids his age are especially active. "I'll be right back," Ray shouted as he left, leaving his parents slightly uneasy. "Wow, Barlow Village is bigger than I thought," said one of the travelers with a large backpack on his back, with a man with a blindfold over one eye standing behind him. "Mr. Traveler, may I ask you a question?" The brown-haired man addressed the two. "Have you seen this boy?" he asked, showing a hand-drawn drawing. He showed a drawing of a blue-eyed, fair-haired boy, adding how handsome he was. The two travelers were confused by the unexpected question, and the one-eyed man looked at the drawing and declared that the drawing was terrible. "Don't rub salt in the wound. I just asked if you saw the kid or not," the guy yelled, waving the drawing. At this time, Ray looked around the village, noticing how much more lively it had become. "No, you don't get it, Viscount." The guy heard a familiar name. His attention was riveted to the conversation. His eyes widened. He couldn't believe what he heard. "I paid a lot of money to find this man," the guy continued to tell the travelers. One of them asked why the gentleman needed this child, to which he replied that he did not know. Perhaps he was very important. Suddenly, the guy who was talking noticed a boy passing by. "Wait!" he called out to him. He looked exactly like the description, and coming closer, he began to carefully examine Ray, trying to catch any confirmation of his guess. The guy, feeling someone else's gaze on him, felt a slight thrill. He didn't understand why he had given in to this man. "Hey, tell the guild you found him," the man shouted to someone, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Don't be afraid. I'm not some strange stranger, but a member of the Information Guild," the stranger confessed, leaning towards Ray. Both stood looking at each other. "Hey, didn't they teach you not to go anywhere with strangers?" Ray felt strange hearing this from a stranger and sensed the irony in his words. "You say the Viscount is looking for me?" The boy agreed, realizing he still needed to check on his patient. While they were riding in the carriage, an unknown man decided to ask a question. "What do you mean when you said patient? Is someone sick in the Vi country?" He was genuinely interested. "Oh yeah," Ray leaned back in his chair, his answer casual and nonchalant. "I wonder how they're doing now," he thought, pretending to smile out loud. The unknown man, looking at the guy, was scared that he was so crazy. The carriage arrived, stopping rather quickly in front of the mansion's gates. "We're already here, please," the coachman announced. The butler and servants greeted them, feigning respect and friendliness. "Welcome," came the butler's voice, and all the servants present and the butler began to shout in unison the words of greeting. "Welcome, Holy Lord." Ray didn't understand anything. Could he really be a saint? This thought was absurd and very strange. So once again, the young man was already sitting at a richly laid table consisting of exquisite dishes. "I'm not the saint you're looking for," Ray stated firmly. He was perplexed. "How can you talk about yourself like that?" the Viscount exclaimed, slamming his fist on the table. "You saved my life. No, you saved my family," the gentleman said. "A man who blessed a commoner like me simply cannot be anything but a saint." The man was full of enthusiasm. Ray didn't know how to explain that it was a routine treatment, but the Viscount's wife entered the room. "There's no denying the fact that you were able to bring our dying family back to life," she said joyfully. The lady called her daughter and with undisguised joy asked her to greet the boy, calling him Sir. "Sir, let me thank you for saving my father." Alika stood in a beautiful pink dress below the knee, gloves on her hands. Ray didn't expect to see her. "Weren't you the one wondering why you brought me here in the first place?" the guy said mockingly, causing Alika to become embarrassed. Her parents stood watching this and were amazed by their daughter's behavior. "Alika, this is not how we raised you," the Viscount said in a raised voice, his voice full of firmness and menace. Ray, listening to the girl being scolded, smiled mockingly. "No, it's not worth it. I was just joking." The guy started stopping everyone. He was a little ashamed of what was passing by and still expressed misunderstanding. "What's wrong with them?" "I'm not a saint," the young man muttered to himself, surrounded by complete confusion. Ray thought, looking around the room. "Where is the man who came with me?" he asked one of the maids, to which she replied that the man was in a hurry. At this time, the unfamiliar man ran as fast as he could. His movements were hasty and nervous, and his face was filled with excitement. "Is this kid really a saint?" he thought as he ran. The man decided to immediately report to the guild upon learning about the holy boy. At this time, Ray hoped that nothing would happen and everything would be fine. Is the food to your liking? Everyone was running around the boy, trying to please him, trying to show him the utmost respect. We tried to make sure that you liked the treats. I am so glad that you were satisfied, exclaimed the Viscount. The guy didn't even think that he would ever again be able to try something as delicious as all these treats. I appreciate such high praise, but I'd like to point out that you needn't worry, because in the Holy Empire you'll be eating like this every day, the gentleman remarked during tea. Ray, struck by the unexpected words, froze in amazement, his face expressing complete confusion. The man, however, was no more surprised than how the boy still did not know about his destiny. I have been informed that a delegation from the Holy Empire is already here and is ready to escort you back, the Viscount continued joyfully. Ray jumped to his feet, not hiding his concern. What kind of revelation did he receive there that he needed me? The guy continued to be perplexed and unable to understand the logic of what was happening. From the story of those sitting in the room, he learned that the Holy Empire is a kingdom blessed by God, and in times of need, he sends revelations to the saints. God could appear to such people in the form of a mark or in someone's dreams, and whoever was a saint was always followed by a ray of light. What will happen to me now? Ray asked worriedly, to which he was told he would be sent to the Holy Empire. Congratulations, Mr. Ray, everyone around exclaimed, blessing the new saint. After such news, the boy returned home and locked himself in his room, which made his parents angry about what had happened to him. Maybe he was tired, Shin and Isle reasoned, deciding to let their son rest a little. At this time, the guy was lying in his room and thinking about the words that had been said to him. He was in a hopeless situation. All he wanted was to peacefully live a second life in this fantasy world, but it seems fate decided otherwise. At this time, there was a beautiful, majestic Scylla fortress in the city, its walls towering over the city. Two maids were discussing who was staying in the secluded building. One of the maids told them that a saint from the sacred empire of Gaia had arrived to them. This saint received a blessing in her youth. She had long hair flowing down her back and eyes like pink diamonds. They said that she was so beautiful that it seemed as if a ray of light always illuminated her. Do you think we'll be able to see her if we're lucky? The two maids wondered curiously. There was a young girl standing near the window. Someone wanted to come in to see her. Come in, she allowed. Thank you, the celebration will begin soon, they answered her standing in the doorway. There is no respite. The girl sighed. A pendant resembling a cross was adorned on her neck, and in the middle was a red sparkling stone. If you are ready, the boy in white clothes began to speak. His voice was a little uncertain. Perhaps he was even afraid of the girl who was above his position. Oh, and one more thing, the girl stopped the messenger, changing her serious emotion. What about the information I asked about the saint? A girl dressed in an elegant dress, her hair neatly pulled back, asked. Her name was Saint Iriel, and she was from the Holy Empire of Gaia. Oh, right, I have good news. The young man turned to the girl, and coming closer, he whispered in her ear all the information he knew. The information seemed incredibly important. The saint smiled at what she heard. He's here, she exclaimed with glee, her eyes shining with happiness and hope. She had finally found someone who could understand her. Ray continued to sit in her room. He kept thinking about what to do, holding his head with both hands. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't come up with anything. And if the Holy Empire found him, then it would all be over. His second life, which was supposed to be peaceful, will become more difficult than the previous one, because he will have to pray and worship a god he does not know for the rest of his life. No, this can't be! The boy screamed hysterically, so much so that even his parents came running. He began to wonder if he should even tell his parents what had happened and run away with them. But nothing might have worked out. There was nowhere to run. They could probably find him anywhere. The Holy Empire will search for him to the end, wherever he may be. You've been acting strange since last night. What happened? Shin asked, turning to her son. Something clicked in Ray's head and he came up with some idea. I'll be back soon, he shouted one last time and burst out of the house like a bullet from a gun. Something is definitely happening to him. The boy's parents spoke anxiously as they watched their son leave the house. So the information is true, right? Two men were talking in the city. They stood leaning against the stone wall, discussing how the Empire had been searching for this boy for a long time. Saint, whispered the stranger who had led Ray to the Viscount, his gaze focused and thoughtful. Another man was looking at a drawing of a boy. You can trust me completely. You are the first person I shared this with, said the boy with brown hair. His words sounded sincere. Another man had already sold this information and all that remained was to figure out where the young man lived. Since Ray was from a lower class, they searched for him on the outskirts of the city. The two were planning to save time while searching the village and concentrate on searching the city area. They still hoped for success. Then, as we agreed, I will return when the Holy Empire pays, the guy answered. He looked into the distance. There was a thick forest. The second man asked the boy what he was thinking about. Have you explored this forest? The stranger asked, pointing at the forest in the distance. Did we check this forest? The second man was puzzled and frightened by this question. The young man suggested that this might be a great place to hide the saint, but the other one confidently replied that if the boy had been there, he would have died, hinting that creatures with elven ears lived in the forest. You know, they hate outsiders. They definitely had enmity towards these strangers. The boy stood thinking about some part of the forest. There was an area in the forest where they weren't, or so the rumors said. Meanwhile, Ray headed into the thicket, every step filled with caution and tension. He hoped that he would come up with something if he took a walk. In his opinion, solitude could help clear his thoughts. The guy kept thinking about how to avoid the hunt. He assumed that the guild was too persistent. In his mind, the only option was to escape. But if that were the case, he would have to be on the run for the rest of his life. A peaceful silence reigned in the forest. The boy sat down on a stone, hoping to clear his head and think about everything again. But suddenly, breaking the fragile peace, sharp sounds were heard from the forest. Ray stood up carefully to inspect the location of the sound and assumed a ready posture. Every rustle and crunch of a branch intensified the feeling of growing danger. Something was approaching closer and closer. The guy immediately thought of people from the Holy Empire. Suddenly, the forest was plunged into an extraordinary silence. Only the light rustling of leaves remained. I don't feel the presence anymore, Ray thought, looking ahead. From the very depths of the forest, out of nowhere, a voice came. A man, said the unknown person. Having stood up, the guy decided to go closer to the place where the noise was coming from. A man? The unknown voice from the void continued. Ray was alarmed by the lack of a visible source of the voice. The stranger asked the guy, "Little man, what are you doing here?" "I was just resting," the young man noted, thinking that it could have been the spirit of the forest. An invisible voice ordered him to leave, calling this place its territory. Ray sighed and, disobeying the stranger, decided to sit on the tree log for another minute, and then go. "I told you to leave right now!" the voice screamed, shaking the tree. Ray didn't understand anything and tensed up. He heard wild anger in his voice. First the Holy Empire, now the unknown voice. No one left him alone. "Hey, I'll leave as you asked." Ray decided to look at the face of the insolent one, and he stood up confidently, expecting the appearance of an unknown creature. "Or I'll stay here, it doesn't matter." The young man gave an ultimatum, not showing a drop of fear. "Go away right now!" the tree screamed, this time even louder than the last. Undeterred by the threat, Ray lay down on the warm stone, enjoying perhaps his last minutes of peace. "Don't say I didn't warn you, little man." An unusual silhouette appeared from the tree. "You think you have the right to kick me out without showing your face?" Ray continued to rant, throwing his head back. A sharp rustling sound was heard from behind the tree, as if someone or something had started moving quickly, and suddenly something jumped, stretching its arm forward. Ray reacted instantly, already preparing for the fight, and he repelled the sudden attack with a powerful flash of bright blue magical light. The attacker was thrown back by the force of the blow. The guy didn't think he would be attacked so suddenly. "If my mana hadn't been activated, everything would have ended badly," the guy said, smiling at his luck. And after seeing who attacked him, he stood up in wild shock. In front of him stood a girl dressed in a green dress. Her appearance was unusual. The tips of her ears were extended. The woman standing in front of the guy had dark, long hair. Her clothes were not like the clothes of people from the city. Ray realized that she was an elf. The guy was amazed that he met an elf in such a place. The forest girl was angry that her attack was blocked. She clearly didn't expect this. "You are an unusual person, aren't you?" she asked. "No, not exactly," Ray answered calmly, a little embarrassed. The girl, having received the answer, began to seem like she was preparing to strike. "You can't stay here!" she screamed and delivered a magical blow. Ray crossed his arms in front of him and parried the attack with dexterity. At the point where their magical powers collided, a powerful explosion occurred, accompanied by a bright flash. The girl was thrown back again by the force of the blow, and leaning against a tree tried to come to her senses. She was surprised that Ray remained unharmed without a single scratch. "Can't be a powerful race?" the elf whispered in slight surprise. The guy was confused by what was said. "I've changed my mind, man. Everything's fine. You can stay in the forest," said the unknown girl. To which Ray replied that he could leave. "We respect the strong. This is the rule of the forest elves Grandel." The girl extended her hand to the guy and invited him to the village of her people. The young man was surprised that there was an elven ancient in the forest. Even though the elf attacked herself, she no longer seemed so dangerous. Ray agreed to go, on the condition that the elf would not attack him. Two people were walking through the forest towards the village. The guy decided to ask the name of the unknown elf. Fia, I am from the Grandel Forest tribe, the girl answered, continuing to walk with a dissatisfied face. Fia, what a beautiful name, Ray thought, speaking his thoughts out loud. The elf turned around sharply and threw an incredibly angry look at the young man, showing how much he didn't like it. Well, it's not a pretty name, she snorted, still with the same angry expression on her face. Anyway, I'm Ray. The guy didn't understand the girl's words and decided to just introduce himself. Meanwhile, the two had already reached the village. Ray stopped and was stunned by what he saw. In front of him, through the dense forest, small houses stood illuminated by the rays of the sun, and higher up on the trees there were bridges forming a transition from tree to another. Small flowers grew everywhere, and the village was imbued with the magic of the forest. The guy was too surprised how something like this could be inside the forest. He had never reached this part before. While Ray looked around and did not believe what was happening, he began to notice the sidelong glances of the villagers. They clearly did not expect to see a person. Everyone wondered why Fia brought a man to their house. Ray, of course, expected this kind of reaction, that everyone would stare at him. Fia, you're back, a blonde elf named Silly exclaimed. She asked who this human child was, thinking that he might be a helper. At this time, Ray stood surrounded by other elves. They were both incredibly happy and surprised to see the boy in the village. It seemed he couldn't even protect himself, Silly reasoned. Fia remembered trying to drive Ray out of their territory, but his powers were too great. The other elf was very surprised how the attacks did not work on the boy. Fia tried to find out if he was from a strong race, but maybe that wasn't the issue. How is Mrs. Era? The girl asked the blonde elf. They both looked at the house high up in the tree. The tree house itself stood on large branches and had a blue-tiled roof, round windows, and a wooden terrace with small railings around it. The girls realized that that same Ira had not yet woken up. Oh, that's right. The elder was looking for you, Silly remembered, turning to the elf. Come on, Ray, Fia shouted, calling the boy to come with her. I knew elves were wary of strangers, but not me, right? The boy asked as they walked towards the treehouse. Of course. Who do you think brought you here? The girl answered with a note of irony in her voice. Ray realized that the elf was a trusted person in this village. The two had already gone upstairs and were heading towards the elder's house. And having reached the right door, Fia knocked carefully. Elder? This is Fia, said the girl, making it clear who had come. The door was opened by a lady with long blonde hair, wearing a white robe and a wide, sincere smile. It's been a long time, so come in, she replied, inviting the two into the house. Fia asked the elder if everything was okay with the lady now. Ray stood there and didn't understand what they were talking about. He was a little confused. Is this a human child? The woman asked. To which Fia replied that he could be a good helper. No, wait, Ray interrupted the two ladies. He was clearly not happy with how they decided for him that he would be some kind of assistant. The conversation continued over a cup of tea. If you become one of us, you will receive many advantages, Fia began to explain, arguing that the guy would be considered a friend of the elf. Ray continued to refuse all words, saying that he did not need it. But they were interrupted by the elder. Fia, I called you today because I want to tell you something. Can you keep it a secret from the other elves? The elder asked, her voice a little worried about something. Fia was very surprised by such a strange request. Of course, elder, she replied. The owner of the house also asked Ray to come out and wait a little outside the door. While some important conversation was taking place in the house, the guy stood and waited outside. Leaning on the railing, he thought about how they were treating him, telling him to come in and then to go out. But at least he was lucky enough to postpone the conversation. The young man kept thinking about the Holy Empire, about this village and the offer to become an assistant to the elves. My life is full of ups and downs, Ray thought as he waited for the next call. Meanwhile, in the city fortress, everyone was looking for the saint. Two servants knelt before Saint Iriel and reported that there was no news. So you are so lazy that you can't find him? The girl asked, clearly disappointed that the saint had not yet been found. Two servants cried out in unison, tearfully, how hard they were trying. But there is no result yet, right? You have done all you could. If there is no result, then you are useless, the lady said, looking down on the people. Two servants immediately began to beg the girl to give her another chance and wait. They were very scared. Iriel looked down at the two with a calm expression but angry eyes. Okay, I'll trust you again, said the girl, causing relief to appear in the servant's eyes. But my patience is far from limitless, just like God's, added the saint. I hope you will keep your word. What do you mean? Is Ms. Era dying because of mana? Strange voices were heard from the treehouse. Her breathing became even, either a sign that she was cured or that she was on the verge of life and death, but she did not wake up. The elder continued to speak. She was very sad. Fia, upon hearing this news, was no less saddened by what she heard. While they were talking, a door in the house was accidentally left ajar, through which Ray heard the conversation. An elf with a rather sad face finally came out to the guy. She looked at the sky and was almost holding back her tears. The treehouse was filled with a silence of sad news and hopelessness. "Is someone sick in this house?" Ray asked, noticing the girl's sad look, to which she replied that he had thought correctly and that someone was quite seriously ill. But Fia came to her senses and realized that the guy had heard the entire conversation. Ray himself also showed some sadness from the sad news. "Are you worried? Even though you are human and we are elves?" Fia asked with a smirk. "You're right, we're different. And why are we trying to study elves if we don't even understand the people around us?" Ray began to think out loud, looking somewhere into the sky. "But still," the guy continued, leaning on the railing, "it doesn't mean that I don't worry about the other being. In the end, it's up to me to decide who I worry about," the young man said, sadness in his voice. Fia just looked at him with some surprise after the boy's words. Finally, the two went back to the house. Having shown hospitality, they poured Ray some tea, and Fia spent the entire time looking at the guy. She saw something alluring and beautiful in him, like a scarlet rose. The girl was so engrossed in looking at the young man that she couldn't even look away. But she still came to her senses in time and realized how long she had been staring at the guy. She didn't understand at all the feelings she experienced when looking at the boy. Suddenly, Ray decided to ask about that elf era, whether she was really sick, which knocked the elf out of her thoughts. "Can I try to heal her?" the guy asked with complete confidence. The girl didn't understand what he meant. Ray explained that he wants to help sick people, regardless of what species they belong to. "And what makes you think you can do it?" Fia thought he might be joking or didn't know what he was talking about. However, the guy, of course, could not guarantee that he would be able to heal, but he could be an excellent opportunity to help that elf. The girl still didn't understand his words and asked him not to talk nonsense. Ray realized that he was not taken seriously, and it seemed he needed to show what he was capable of. "Okay," he sighed and prepared to show his magic. With a movement of his hand, a sharp blue magical flame immediately formed. The elf sitting opposite immediately jumped up, taking out her sword, considering the guy's actions to be dangerous. Ray grabbed the sharp magical object with his other hand, and he stabbed himself in the leg, creating a wound from which drops of blood immediately flowed. The guy felt a piercing pain and screamed a little. "What the hell are you doing?" Fia screamed, not expecting this from the boy. She walked up to Ray and immediately began examining the wound and thinking about what to do. But there was no need to do anything. The guy himself used the healing spell and the house sparkled with light from magic. A blue mana formed around Ray like a whirlpool. Fia looked at what was happening, very surprised. The guy continued to heal his leg wound with his magic. He felt pain from the wound, but he tried his best. At this time, the villagers began to notice the light of mana from the house and began to wonder what was going on. A bright blue light shone from the windows of the room. It shimmered and sparkled. Ray finished casting his magic and sighed tiredly. There was nothing left of the wound. Only a torn piece of pants was visible where the blow had been inflicted. Fia couldn't believe her eyes and was very surprised. "If there is anyone who can help this elf," Ray said very seriously and stood up. "It was most likely me." His gaze was full of confidence. "I can't allow this." The elder didn't particularly like what she was told. Fia began to object, to which the woman explained that this would be considered disrespectful to Mrs. Ira. Mrs. Ira was the object of universal adoration, like a goddess. "Even if it is for a good purpose, I will not allow the use of untested methods," the elder answered firmly. "But we can save her," Fia began to convince again, but she was immediately stopped. The head of the village did not want to hear about it. "Go away," she blurted out in an angry voice. Fia was very upset that nothing worked out, and Ray thought about the object of adoration while comprehending the words about the mistress. He did not understand what the point of adoration was if Ira died. The sun was already beginning to set, and its yellow-orange rays were breaking through the branches of the trees. "It didn't work out. I'm so sorry," Fia said as the two walked down the path. She already had hope that there was a chance to cure the lady. Ray immediately began to calm the girl down. The situation could very well resolve itself. Fia smiled slightly at the guy's words. She was pleased that he cared. "Can I come here sometimes?" the young man asked with a smile on his face. The elf, of course, allowed Ray to stay here, especially since he had already managed to gain the favor of other elves. "Thank you," the young man said, looking at the girl with kind and sincere eyes. "I have to go," the guy noticed, and Fia immediately became upset. Ray noticed the elf's mood and hastened to explain that he still had unfinished business. The girl, although she didn't show it, didn't want to let go. "I'll be back tomorrow, so don't be upset," the guy promised. "Whoever said I was upset better get lost before I change my mind," she said with deliberate rudeness, trying to hide her mood. And she watched the guy as he walked further and further away from her. Ray gradually disappeared into the foliage, still enveloped in the soft light of the sunset, as if dissolving in the warmth of the passing day. The elf's face changed as she watched the departure and suddenly became sad. And when Ray moved further and further away from her, she headed towards the house, stopping to follow him with her eyes. The guy, noticing that he was no longer being watched, abruptly turned off the road, and like the wind rushing forward, he ran back to the village so that no one would notice him. Having climbed a tall tree and looked around, he carefully examined the house where the lady was. Ray looked at the same elder's house. The rays of the sun added brightness to the house. It seemed so cozy. "Sorry, but I can't abandon the patient without trying all possible options," thought Ray, looking at the necessary doors. And quietly, moving closer, he opened the door where Mrs. Ira was. In front of him was a bright alley, strewn with red flowers and golden trees. Everything sparkled. And in the distance, a luxurious door with an unusual ornament appeared. "And I thought that there would be an ordinary house inside," thought Ray, surprised by the size of the room. Walking further, he opened the tall double doors and found himself in a white corridor. Looking through the crack in the door, Ray's eyes widened at what he saw. In front of him lay a young girl on a bed strewn with yellow flowers, and in front of her shone a bright white light. Coming closer, the guy saw a sleeping girl with white iridescent hair. Her skin was shining, and she herself was like an angel in appearance. Her hands were clasped together as if sealed with a riddle, and she herself lay motionless, impenetrable by time. The girl was wearing a white dress that left her shoulders bare. Her hair was loose, spreading over the place where she lay, adding even more mystery. Ray gasped at the beauty he saw, which seemed unnatural in this place and at this time. He immediately became transfixed, looking at the beauty of the young lady, but quickly came to his senses. The first thing he did was feel the pulse, carefully touching the girl's hand so as not to disturb her peace. Then, leaning closer, Ray checked his breathing carefully, listening to the quiet inhalations and exhalations. The pulse and breathing were normal. It remains to find out what caused her restless state. The guy took the girl's hand to continue the examination and tried to understand the problem. And he used his powerful mana to examine the body more carefully and find the disease. The guy examined every part of the body and looked deep into each vessel. "Her body is fine too. She really is on the verge of life and death. Is this a joke?" Ray thought, not finding the cause of the illness. "Is there really nothing I can do for Ira?" Ray continued to think, clutching his head. He definitely needed to learn more about the diseases of this world. But suddenly the young man noticed something. Ray listened to his feelings. He felt an unknown and unpleasant smell coming from the lying girl. Turning the lady on her side, the guy saw what was causing the unpleasant smell. There were wounds on the girl's back that didn't look like bed sores, but they were quite widespread across her entire back. During all this time, they didn't think to check the body? Ray was indignant. He couldn't understand how they hadn't even managed to fully examine the object of adoration. The wounds were large and the boy lacked disinfectants. Ray began to look around for auxiliary items. His eyes fell on a small lake and a green meadow strewn with grass. The young man made a vessel from branches and leaves that resembled a cup without handles, and he scooped up water from the bright blue lake. After placing the bowl, Ray cast a healing spell on the water. Since it was dangerous to use healing magic directly, the boy decided to purify the water and give it healing properties. He scooped up a small amount of water into his palm, and he prepared himself to treat the lady. But before that, he began to remember how everyone here treated her. Even with his good intentions, he couldn't experiment and let the girl die. "I hope I don't get into trouble for touching a sacred creature," Ray thought, and set to work with full determination. The wound on his back was already covered with strange spots and was growing larger and larger. The guy thought that the elves, who did nothing and simply abandoned the lady, could not, in general, object to him. With light movements, Ray began to apply the healing water and applied small portions to each side of the wound. He did this with each affected area, carefully monitoring even the slightest changes. While the guy was treating, a bright orange sunset had already set in, and a light aroma of evening freshness could be felt in the air. Noticing this, Ray immediately hurried to get ready to go home. "This is the best I could do until I figure out what was going on," the young man thought, glancing at the girl who still hadn't come to her senses. It would be worth dropping in and finding out how things were going tomorrow, he thought, realizing that caring for and treating her required constant attention. Meanwhile, the city's fortress was in anticipation of news of a new saint. The guards reported to Saint Iriel that the search was already underway and it was only a matter of time. "Do you even know how many times I've heard that?" the saint hissed, clearly tired of news without results. She reminded her servants not to forget her intentions and not to test her patience. At these words, the servants immediately fell to their knees and began to apologize. "Forget it," said Iriel, rising from her chair. "There is no longer any faith in your words," she declared, looking down at the servants. It was time to take matters into her own hands. The saint was very confident and determined to search. Ray stood over the lady and examined her affected back. The wound already looked much better and, according to the guy, should heal by next week. As time went on, Ray would sneak into Ira's house and take care of her. First, he washed his body with purified water, then he kneaded the stiff muscles, and in his free time he studied books from the lady's library. Sometimes Ray would look at the lady's drawings and laugh while talking to her. Every time I contacted her, I never received a response. But despite this, he talked about everything, about what he saw on the road, or what happened to Fia, even about the most insignificant little things that came to mind. And so the month flew by. "Ira, I'm back!" Ray shouted one day as he entered the chambers again. And heading towards the lady, he began to tell her that Fia had a day off today, and that's why the guy decided to have tea with her. But suddenly he noticed how the lady was emitting a strange smell, and a dark light was shining around her. Ray didn't understand anything, but his heart began to beat faster with anxiety. And he suddenly ran to the lying girl. Perhaps time was running out in a matter of minutes. Her breathing became heavy and her lips pursed. The guy noticed, completely panicked. The lady's sighs became rare and muffled. The situation became even more serious. What to do? The young man wondered. He didn't even think that everything could turn out like this. Where is this respirator? Ray began to think for a second, like in his past life. But he quickly remembered that he was not in the hospital and began to do something himself. The truth is that the only thing he could do right now was absolutely nothing. The lady continued to breathe heavily and each new breath seemed like the last. "Ira, you can't die! Wake up!" Ray screamed in panic, shaking the girl by the shoulders. He could not understand what the problem was, because there was no external damage or lethal poisoning, and vital organs were functioning absolutely normally. The guy still couldn't understand what the matter was. There must be a way to heal her at once, Ray thought, looking at the girl. And then he came to his senses. He wasn't sure if he should use the healing. There was a risk that Ira might not be able to withstand his mana and might die. The boy looked at the lady again, trying to understand how to help her in such a terrible situation. He studied medicine so hard to save people, but at a critical moment he could not think of anything better. Still, it was worth trying to do at least something. Otherwise, the consequences could be irreversible. I have to do everything in my power, Ray thought, and began to accumulate mana, filling with blue light. And with a bright flash, magic enveloped the lying body, forming a healing field. From the house itself, a blue light also appeared, penetrating every corner of the room. The townspeople began to notice that it was the same as the last time the boy used magic. Ray tried his best to do no harm and to heal the lady. "Ira, I believe in you. Please hold on," he shouted in the hope that the girl would now open her eyes. Pointing his hands forward, the guy shouted a spell and, gathering all his strength, began to heal. From the power of magic, the body began to rise, and it hovered above the guy, filled with sparks and blue mana light. The light became even brighter, the magic became stronger, and the girl soared higher and higher. The elves, watching the windows of the house, did not understand what was happening. The entire house was filled with bright flashes of magic, so much so that it was difficult to see. Fia immediately thought of Ray. She quickly ran towards the house from which the light was still shining so brightly. The girl did not understand when he had time to start treatment. Even Ray is trying his best. And my fellow elves, how have we helped? Fia thought as she ran to the lady and the boy, a tear running down her cheek. The elf quickly opened the doors and burst into the room like an arrow. In front of her stood Ray, who filled the entire room with healing magic. Raising his hands up, he used all his strength to revive Ira. A bead of sweat ran down his face. His strength was at its limit. "Just a little more," he shouted and tried to finish the job to the end. Feeling the changes in the lady's body, Ray stopped, not fully understanding whether it worked or not. Ira's body hung in the air, supported like a cocoon of magic. The two looked at what was happening and begged for everything to work out. It began to get light around and the magic began to fade. And as if by a shockwave, Fia was thrown back. Ray took the brunt of the blow and was lifted into the air for a few seconds. The guy couldn't withstand the power of magic and fell to the ground without coming to his senses. Opening one eye, he looked at the lady who already looked alive. She finally opened her blue eyes. She came to life. Ira, Ray said, reaching out to the girl. But the strength in his body gradually faded, and the guy closed his eyes, losing consciousness. Ray began to feel some kind of dark, endless space, as if he were in water. It was very cozy, and the guy wanted to at least stay in this feeling of calm and relaxation for a little while longer. But suddenly, he began to hear a voice from nowhere. "I repeat to you that this man will be under my protection," the voice said. "But Ira, this is a person." Two female voices were arguing about what the boy did. Hearing the voice, Ray understood what was being discussed. "I'm not going to listen to this anymore. While you abandoned me for 20 years, Ira continued to shout at the elder, this man decided to do everything possible. The lady continued to argue that wasn't it funny who saved her, not those who idolized her so much, but the person who simply sincerely pitied her. Ira's voice, like a breath of wind on a quiet summer evening, enveloped the guy in warmth. "Ira," came from the lips of Ray, who woke up from a long sleep. He finally came to consciousness. He jumped up abruptly and his gaze, full of confusion, darted around. The guy immediately thought he was in a dream. "Man," a voice whispered from the corner of the room. "Did you call me?" Ray turned to see who had approached him, and before him, like a vision from another world, appeared the beautiful Ira. She sat like a flower and looked at the boy with curiosity and tenderness. "I'm here," she said in an angelic voice, her eyes shining and she seemed to be filled with light. Ray, captivated by the beauty and grace, could not take his eyes off her. He looked her over from head to toe. "The picture you found in the book." The girl began to speak and hugged the guy tightly. Ray did not expect this at all. "I drew it out of boredom." "No wonder it's so funny," Ira continued to exclaim, hugging and embarrassing the guy. "Did you hear?" Ray was surprised, his eyes wide, to which the lady replied that she heard absolutely everything, like an all-seeing eye. She touched the boy's face, full of surprise and confusion, and a tear ran down his cheek. "Why are you crying?" the girl asked, still softly, sincerely and gratefully looking at Ray, as if he were the most precious treasure. "Thank you. You were the only one who cared about me." The two of us sat on a white bed, and the sky was filled with scarlet. Ira asked what the boy's name was, since she hadn't known it all this time. The guy, who had already recovered from the storm of emotions, answered the question with a smile. "Ray," the lady whispered and thought for a second, and she exclaimed sharply, "What a beautiful name." It was already getting dark outside. The sun had almost set below the horizon. Ray watched from the window what was happening in the village. "Do you want to go for a walk now that you're awake?" "The elves are very worried about you," the guy asked, looking at the girl. "They have visited me occasionally for the last 20 years, but no one has really cared about me," the girl replied, expressing concern and resentment for her people. The lady's face suddenly changed to aggressive. Her anger about this would not subside in one day. Ray may have understood the girl to some extent, but he decided to lighten the mood and ask a question. "By the way, when did you regain consciousness?" Ira didn't quite understand the question. "Well, I wonder how long it took you to regain consciousness," the guy answered. "I never lost it. I was conscious the whole time," Ira said calmly. Ray was surprised for a second. "Are you saying that you were conscious from the moment you were struck by the disease?" The boy was amazed how it was possible to remain conscious for 20 years. How she just lay there without the ability to move even a finger and just waited for so long. "You really?" started to say Ray. "You're a smart girl. You did it." He took the girl by the hands and tried to support her. Ira froze at his words. Her eyes began to fill with tears. She began to sob, tears streaming down her cheeks, and her expression immediately fell. The girl shared that she used to despise people. She saw them as the source of all misfortunes, and all their actions seemed to be imbued with selfishness and indifference, without knowing a drop of regret. It was this heartlessness that led Ira to decide to hate people. The girl remembered how Ray courted her, how the guy tried his best to help her and always spoke as if he felt she could hear everything. At first, she was really furious at how the man treacherously touched her and promised to cure her. But in the end, she realized that Ray was different. He didn't want anything in return. He just gave her so much care and love. He put in so much effort. Ira remembered how Ray, not knowing that she was conscious, still talked to her. And mentally, I always answered him. One day, a guy found information about the flower dayhair in a book and immediately thought about the flowers at the entrance. But the lady was thinking about something else. She was thinking how similar these flowers were to him, because their meaning was sacrifice and smile. A memory surfaced of Ray looking at Ira's drawings, and she mentally answered him and was glad that someone was talking to her sincerely. Every time the guy talked to the girl, it was very difficult for Ira. She really wanted to answer at least once so that he could hear, and she didn't want more. "Thank you, Ray," Ira cried, sobbing loudly, unable to contain her emotions. The guy patted the crying girl on the back for not giving up. Ira couldn't take it anymore and threw herself at the young man with hugs. That same evening, an interrogation took place at the Viscount's estate regarding the location of the saint. "I'm sorry, but we really don't know," the Viscount mumbled, hanging his head. Ariel, not having received any information, apologized for the late reception and turned around. However, she began in a menacing voice. "If you lied and hid the saint, keep in mind that the temple will make every effort to interrogate you." The saint threw one last thing to the family and walked away. Later, Ariel held a map of the city in her hands. After searching the entire kingdom, not a single trace was found. "The only place where he could be is here," the saint thought, and pointed her finger at the forest on the map. "We're heading into the forest immediately." The girl gave a clear order to her guards. Night fell. The sun gave way to the moon, and thousands of stars sparkled in the sky. "And what punishment awaits me from the villagers?" Ray asked the lady. "There will be no punishment," the girl answered. Her sentence of mercy sounded very fair after all. He was their hero. "And mine too," added Ira. "If suddenly someone appears who shows disrespect to you," the girl began to think out loud. I explained everything to him clearly. The girl's voice was very confident, and it was clear that she was not to be trifled with. Ray kept thinking that even though Ira had woken up, the other elves weren't in a hurry, which meant that it could only mean one thing: a stunning flow of mana that could scare everyone away. The guy was so deep in thought that he didn't hear his name being called. Pouring her mana into my body, Ira began to speak, taking the young man's hand. "You held my hand all the time. At first I was very scared because I didn't know that there could be someone nearby who had mana that could affect my body." The girl held Ray's hand, stroking it slightly. She told him that when she felt his mana, she realized that there were still good people left in the world. And she asked Ray not to focus on other things and just be there. The guy was satisfied with everything and just smiled. "Ah, I was wondering about something, Ira. How old are you?" Ray asked. The girl didn't really like this question. "It's a secret, actually," Ira muttered. "Since elves live longer than humans, you are about 200 years old?" the young man reasoned enthusiastically. The girl was embarrassed by the question and turned away. "Or 500? The guy continued to guess enthusiastically. "A whole 1,000? Ray exclaimed. But Ira immediately stopped him in his guesses. She was not that old after all. "What are you even thinking?" the girl screamed, upset by the joke. Having calmed down, Ira smirked, looking at the guy. "It's so funny," she said. "I have never experienced this. Do people call this happiness?" the lady asked. And in her eyes there really was a hint of happiness and calm. Ray called her weird for being happy when she was teased. But the girl didn't care. She was truly and sincerely happy. This feeling was not particularly familiar to her because she had never been particularly interested in anything. "Do you think you can be happy now?" the guy asked. "Only if you're around, Ray," Ira sang with a smile on her face. The guy thought about how he treated the lady back then. He constantly felt inferior. He may have been the best doctor in his past life, but in this one he is just a helpless man hoping for a miracle. The most important thing in medicine is experience. That's what you need to gain. And since the Holy Empire is now the most advanced in terms of medicine and his envoys are looking for him, there was only one thing left to do: become a saint and gain all the knowledge and experience of the Holy Empire. Ray was sad that he couldn't spend more time with Ira, but there was nothing he could do. "It seems to be getting quite noisy outside. What's going on?" The two noticed and turned towards the door. "Elder, please answer us something," the elves gathered around shouted. The two went out of the house to see what was going on outside. The elves screamed why they were kept from knowing that Era was in danger of death. What could have happened if the village had been attacked, or they had been in danger of extinction? "I ask you for forgiveness again. I am very sorry, this is all my fault," the elder apologized to everyone. Ray, watching what was happening, thought that it was not worth interfering yet. "While I was bedridden, none of them even thought to visit me," Ira said in an icy tone, looking at the indignant elves. "Disgusting," she whispered, and prepared to jump, thereby scaring the guy. And it was as if an arrow flew down, and her dress, like flower petals, fluttered in flight. In a matter of seconds, Ira found herself at the bottom and landed with light movements on the ground. "Ira?" the elder stuttered, moving away from the girl. "Stop right now," Ira said, frowning and savage. The elves, seeing the lady, immediately began to bow and whisper her name. "I can't listen to this anymore. Did any of you bother to come to me while I was sick?" the girl asked. She was very angry and at the same time filled with resentment. The villagers stood in bewildered silence. Ira looked at everyone angrily. Her gaze was sharp like a blade, piercing everyone nearby. "Just look at yourselves. Not one of you has lifted a finger, so why did you come here and attack the elder?" The girl screamed, pointing out that everyone here is to blame. The elves remained ashamed and silent and did not know what to say. The lady made one elf speak if there was something to say. "If the elder had told us everything, we would have definitely come to you," answered one of the residents. The elder immediately began to deny his words. Ray, who was watching everything, already understood that all this would not lead to anything good. "How dare you?" Ira was filled with enormous anger. Her gaze, her voice, and she herself radiated incredible anger. "Say something like that." She screamed and was illuminated by the blue light of her own mana. Magic shone around. The girl was preparing to strike, and as if by a shockwave, it knocked everyone to the ground. The elf who spoke to Ira was pierced by magic through his body and began to convulse. He fell down lifeless, foaming at the mouth. "Ungrateful little bastards," the girl hissed. "If everyone thinks it's my fault, then I'll just leave the forest, just like you want," Ira said, looking around at everyone. The elder began to shout at the girl and stop her. After her, the rest of the elves began to dissuade and apologize while kneeling. "Ira is okay, right?" Ray thought as he watched the girl return to him. "Doesn't the departure of the leader from the elven settlement mean that they become completely defenseless?" the guy thought. But the girl still did not turn to him. "Ira," he called out, watching as the lady stood with her back to him without moving a muscle. "Are you really going to do this?" Ray asked. But Ira, looking somewhere upward, still stood with her back to the guy and remained silent. A little later, they both went into the house. "How can you disregard the authority of a high elf?" Ira continued to be angry. Her anger knew no bounds. "Do you really want to leave?" the guy asked, sitting next to the girl. To which Ira replied that it was still better than seeing them constantly squabbling. "Besides, I wasn't really noticed before," the girl said sadly, looking down. Ray tried to find out where the elf would go when she left the village. "There is one place I would like to go," the girl began to say. She'd only been looking after them for 20 years, but she was already so exhausted. "Only 20? So you really are about 1,000, Ray laughed. But the girl immediately stopped him so that he would stop mocking in an attempt to find out her age. "Please show yourself, Ira." The streets were filled with the sounds of residents shouting apologies and begging the lady to come out. Ira immediately became depressed when she heard the elves' cries. "You made this decision in a fit of anger, didn't you?" Ray tried to smooth things over and somehow cheer the girl up, but Ira said that elves don't lie, and that she really was going to leave. "You see, if they hurt you badly, it doesn't mean that they don't need you," the guy reassured the girl, trying to set her on the right path. However, Ira agreed with the young man's words. There was some truth in them. "You're right. They need me." Ray's girl supported her and began to stand up. The guy smiled and was very glad that the situation was resolved for now. "Ray, I'm wondering something." The girl stood up and asked a question a little hesitantly. "Would you like to stay here with me?" Ira's question sounded like a note of hope for a better life. But this proposal took the guy by surprise, and he looked at the girl in surprise. "Thank you for the offer, but I can't," Ray replied with a note of sadness, as if there was a slight desire to stay in the village. Ira immediately asked why he couldn't. "I need to go to the Holy Empire," the guy said clearly. The elf was surprised by the young man's words, and he said that they were already looking for him. "They think I'm a saint or something. They claim that some kind of prophecy or something like that was received about me," Ray explained, not fully understanding what was going on. Ira began to ask questions about how this was a prophecy from God, wondering that he was a saint, because he uses magic, not divine power. Ray himself didn't really understand how this happened, but it seemed to be all because he had allegedly not been baptized, a saint without divine powers. There was a huge difference between a saint and an ordinary person, the girl thought. She wondered if the guy had actually used magic when he treated her, and Ray explained that he wasn't entirely sure either, because he hadn't intended to use magic, but the situation was urgent and there was no other choice. For some reason, Ira's illness only affected her ability to use mana, but left her consciousness untouched, like a curse. It was strange how the guy claimed to have used healing to heal, which was only the first circle of basic magic, and that already showed how amazing his magic was. On top of all this, he was a saint without divine powers, making him one of the most unlikely saints in history. Ray looked at the girl with bewilderment as she considered his words. Ira sighed and returned to thinking about her problem. "I feel so pathetic that I can't decide whether to stay or leave the village." The girl breathed out her thoughts. "Okay, it's time for us to go," said the elf with a smile on her face. The two returned to all the villagers who were already kneeling and worshipping the lady. "And what can you say in your defense?" Ira asked, addressing all the elves. Everyone started saying that they had been incredibly rude and apologizing for not accepting protection. The elves deeply regretted their behavior and asked the lady to be merciful. In that case, I give up my intentions to leave the village, Ira declared. Of course, she understood why everyone was angry at the elder, but the girl began to explain that no one wished them harm. If they knew about her condition, the humans might find out and the elves would be in danger. However, this does not cancel your guilt, added Ira, still standing majestically in front of everyone. And since both sides were to blame, the girl thought that it was worth discussing everything and sorting out the situation, because if there was no elder, there would be no one to protect and look after the village. The elves, lowering their heads, only agreed with the lady's words. Ira nodded approvingly and was glad that everything was resolved and fell into place. And since she was no longer angry, the girl clapped and declared, "Why don't we have a feast in honor of our savior?" The boy was confused by this suggestion. What kind of feast is this out of the blue? At the same time, a battle was taking place deep in the forest. The guards of the Holy Empire, dressed in silver armor and swords, fought with the stone giant, calling him a brainless monster. Iriel also stood in line and gave orders not to surrender because they needed to clear a path. They had to get to the right place before the end of the day, so she fought skillfully herself, using her magic. The very next day, when the sun was shining outside, the army set up camp in the middle of the forest. "It looks like we won't reach the elven village until the end of the day," one of the saint's servants reported. "Considering that our reconnaissance party is not that big, don't you think that we have been advancing for too long?" said Iriel, who was sitting and drinking tea, and her dress and jewelry had changed to a white suit and her hair tied up. She asked what they thought about this. Since there were many monsters in this area, some difficulties arose. The guard continued to report, but nevertheless, he believed that the army was advancing at a good speed. The saint was clearly unhappy with this news and snapped that she would have gotten there much faster alone. The servant immediately began to apologize, trying to make amends. Iriel finished her tea, put the mug back and stood up abruptly. "It seems we've had enough rest, so let's get moving," the girl gave the order. The village was filled with a festive atmosphere. A feeling of happiness was in the air, mixed with the aromas of delicious food. Ray, of course, was not particularly happy about such a feast in his honor. The entire village was decorated with balloons and garlands, and confetti was flying in the air. The guy was perplexed by such a large-scale event. The whole village seemed to sparkle with celebration. The elves were having fun and dancing to cheerful music. Suddenly, someone tapped the guy on the shoulder and called him. "Glad to see you, Ray. Everyone's probably been waiting for you," Fia shouted joyfully. She invited the young man to join the celebration, but Ray himself clearly did not expect such a scale and thought that it would all be more modest. "You are the savior of our village," the girl noted. Unfortunately, Fia herself could not stay for the holiday. She still had unfinished business. The guy asked where the elf would go. "On such festive days, the village lets down its guard. Do you think I don't care about work?" Fia explained, grabbing her sword. "Enjoy the holiday, see you soon," the girl shouted at last and hurried to her work. Ray stood and thought about something. He also thought that everything would be fine. "Fia!" the boy shouted, calling the elf. "Let's meet tonight. Eat something tasty," Ray shouted as the girl had already gone far away. But Fia immediately forgot about her work and ran like a bullet to the guy. "Really? Are you serious?" the elf screamed, tugging at the edges of Ray's shirt. The girl admitted that this was the first time she had been invited somewhere like this. Ray stood in shock from the reaction, but at the same time he understood that she had been living in the depths of the forest all this time. Fia, clearly happy with such an offer, ran to carry out her work duties, shouting at the end so that he would not forget his words and keep his promise. Ray fell to the ground and was glad that the girl agreed to spend time together. "It looks like it's time for me to go too," the young man thought, and headed deeper into the decorated village. The elves joyfully greeted the lady's savior. The young elven girls invited him to sit with them, thereby embarrassing the guy. And the elves offered to taste various treats. Although Ray was grateful for such a feast, it was all tiring. The celebration continued, and the lady's house still stood on the tall tree. The doors to her house were slightly open. Ira sat and drank tea. "Why is the hero of the evening sitting here?" she asked the guy who was also in the house. Ray replied that he was tired from the feast and could not find another place to rest. "Then stay and rest," suggested Ira, calling the guy to the table and offering him some tea. Ray came closer and smelled an unknown smell. "It's the scent of dayher flowers," he exclaimed, realizing that the smell came from the lady's drink. "Yes, you are right. This is my own way of celebrating this special day," Ira explained, and poured tea into the second mug. The guy began to try the wonderful drink. "Ira, why don't you come down?" Ray asked, wondering how the lady was sitting alone and not having fun with her people. The elf didn't expect that such a topic would come up over tea, but the guy immediately made it clear that if she didn't want to talk, then she didn't have to. Well, I think I don't have to hide it from you, Ira thought out loud and began her story. She told that once upon a time there was a great conflict between an elf and a high elf. High elves are born already having a certain status and are considered by their nature to be more majestic beings than common elves, and therefore, regardless of their age, high elves become objects of adoration for other elves. However, one elf had a conflict with a young high elf, and she decided to leave the village. I think you know what happened next, Ira clarified. Ray himself guessed that to prevent something like this from happening, she locked herself here. And then the girl continued speaking. But something distracted her from her story. She jumped up abruptly and looked towards the exit. Ira, what is it? Ray asked, surprised by the violent reaction to something. It seems like something happened on the outskirts of the village. Ira's tone was slightly worried. It seemed that there were uninvited guests in the forest, which made the lady nervous. At first, Ray did not understand what kind of uninvited guests could come to such a part of the forest. But he suddenly thought about those who were looking for him. At this time, the guards were already near the village. What are people doing here? Fia stood ready to strike and defend her home. She didn't understand why someone had come here and brought an entire army. We are not here to fight, Iriel said firmly, standing next to the army. We just want to see the saint, she replied with a grin and without a drop of fear. Fia understood what was going on and was seriously angry that someone had wandered into the elven territory. The atmosphere was tense. The elf fearlessly listened to what the saint would tell her. Just in case, she took hold of the hilt of the sword so that if anything happened, she could immediately strike at the army. We are here to find the saint, Iriel continued to explain, her eyes reflecting calm and confidence. There is no such thing here, so go back to where you came from, Fia stated firmly. The saint came closer and explained that she only wanted to talk, and asked if the elf had seen the white-haired boy. The girl's expression changed in an instant. She realized that they were talking about Ray. Iriel, seeing the emotions, was convinced of her suspicions. So you really saw him, the saint thought out loud. But Fia immediately began to deny and say that she did not know who this saint was. The girl began to worry. The problem was gaining momentum. Iriel insisted that she had come to fight only to accompany the saint, and they will leave as soon as they finish all their business, and if the elf helps in the search, she will be thanked. Fia, not wanting to give up and reveal the boy, began to take out her sword. This made the guards tense up and begin to draw their swords as well. Since you are so warlike, then bloodshed is inevitable, sighed Iriel, making it clear that if they give her the saint right away, everything will end peacefully and no one will suffer. He saved us all. For his protection, all my fellow tribesmen will only be glad to join me, hissed Fia, her anger already at its peak. The saint sighed, seeing how aggressively the elf was disposed. If you stand in our way, a holy war could very well start, Iriel began to fear, and she asked if Fia herself wanted this. The girl was not exactly frightened by this expression, but was worried by the statement. It dawned on her that the people standing before her were from the Holy Empire. The elf had no choice but to show that she was not afraid, and with a sharp movement she drew her sword, standing in a pose ready for battle. So that's your answer? Iriel asked proudly. Fia was ready for anything, and the army itself wanted it. With one movement of her hand, the saint gave the soldiers a sign of readiness and pointed her hand at the elf. Clear the way, she gave the order clearly and stood to wait for her task to be carried out. The guards rushed towards Fia. The girl looked at the approaching army and prepared to strike. In a second, she disappeared somewhere. The guards stood there in bewilderment and began to look around in search of the elf. Out of nowhere, with a sharp movement, Fia rushed past one of the guards and cut his neck. The fighter screamed in pain and surprise. Iriel stood and watched the fight. Initially, it seemed to her that Fia had great strength, but she quickly realized that she only had a beginner level of Aura Blade. Two servant girls with magic whispered a protective spell for the fighters, and with the spell healing, they raised the guards to their feet, their armor sparkling with magic. But a sword flew into the back of one of the servants, causing her to fall immediately. The enemy closed ranks faster than we expected, the head of the army shouted, giving clear orders. But the sword pierced him so quickly that he didn't have time to understand anything. Another Holy Empire mage quickly began to heal him with magic, but the blade struck him too, and he fell bleeding. There are too many of them, and thanks to the healing magic they don't die. If things continue like this, they will easily break through, Fia thought, looking at the futile attempts to kill the army. She didn't have much strength left, and constantly healing the fighters had tired her out. There was only one way out for her, and that was to strike at the saint herself. And with a huge leap, she jumped towards Iriel. The saint stood too calmly and watched the blade approach. Fia dealt a crushing blow, but something didn't go according to plan. The saint stopped the approaching blow with her hand using divine magic. That's the difference in power, Iriel grinned sarcastically. It didn't take much effort for her to crush and break the elf's blade. Having gathered all the divine mana, the saint clenched her hand into a fist, and she hit Fia with all her might, accompanying the blow with a bright yellow flash. The elf flew off somewhere upwards, and she fell to the ground almost unconscious. Iriel was a little surprised that the elf was still holding on after her blow. Fia, of course, suffered a lot, but continued the fight and, having cleared her throat, rose to her feet again. "You will not pass," the girl declared, holding the injured area of the blow on her chest. The saint was only amused by such persistence from someone weaker than her. "There is no need to be so stubborn, just hand over the saint to us," Iriel repeated once again, giving one last chance for a peaceful conversation. But the elf did not want to give up and took the first branch she came across in her hand and used magic to form a kind of sword. The end of the branch glowed blue, giving Fia at least some chance to fight. "You'll never get it," the girl screamed. The corners of her mouth were bloody from the blow, but she held herself very confidently and prepared to attack. "Still far?" Rei and Ira ran as fast as they could towards danger. They were already close, the girl felt it. "We're almost there," she sighed as she ran. Rei kept wondering how many people were there. Did the Holy Empire really bring an entire army? Arriving at the scene, the two stood up in horror. There were bloodstains on the grass and flowers. Fia was bleeding from all the attacks, and around her stood an army waiting to strike. The elf was on her last legs, her strength was almost exhausted, and her wounds were significant. "Get out of my way, Fia, can you hear me?" The boy screamed, running towards the girl, pushing everyone in his path. Everyone present was interested in the color of Rei's hair. The army guessed that it was a saint, and they finally found him. "We came here for you, Holy Lord," they shouted in unison and fell on one knee, bowing to the boy. "Nice to meet you, Saint," Iriel introduced herself as she walked closer through the pools of blood. "I am Saint Iriel Belize." The girl was all covered in bloodstains and a little dented. Rei looked at everyone around him very aggressively. "Ira?" he called out to the lady who clearly wanted to do something. The elf asked the guy to stay put and not approach the saint. "If you don't want to die, don't stand in my way," Ira said menacingly. The guards were frightened by such words. Ira helped Fia get up, asking if she was okay. But the girl kept repeating one thing, that she had to stop the saint. "Stop," Fia continued to whisper, even though she was completely wounded and without strength. Rei examined the girl and noticed that her shoulder was dislocated, and it was surprising how she was holding up alone. The guy had no choice but to set the bone through the pain. "Saint, let's go to the fortress together," Iriel exclaimed joyfully, inviting the boy to go with them. But Rei didn't even listen to her and continued to treat the elf's dislocated shoulder. He tore off a piece of his shirt and applied a bandage to the girl's bloody stomach. "Since you have been chosen by God himself to perform a great deed, it is high time for you to begin your duties," the saint continued to say, calling the boy to go with them. Rei didn't like these words at all. "Action? You said action?" The guy began to be indignant. "Exactly. Then what do you think is the point of your being chosen by God himself?" Uriel exclaimed, explaining that God's intention is to choose people who perform miracles. The guy tensed up at these words. Did these people really think that their actions could be justified by some higher purpose? But the saint claimed that initially she simply asked peacefully and tried to resolve everything peacefully, even warning in advance that she might hit. But no one listened to her. "So you're saying that invading their territory and using force to take me away is completely justified?" Rei appeared. He was very unhappy with this arrangement, to which Iriel replied that it was simply necessary. "Did you think I would just agree and follow you?" The guy snapped, showing that he was not afraid. "I would not wish to use force against a person like you, Saint." Iriel's emotions quickly turned negative. All this time, Ira couldn't believe her ears. How dare they invade their territory and cause inconvenience, and even threaten their savior? "Why don't we test what you're capable of?" the lady suggested. But Iriel only threw out words about how pathetic it was to oppose some elf to the power of the Holy Empire. This only made Ira even more angry, and she suggested checking whether she was bluffing or not. "How dare you threaten a saint? You will pay for your words," the army screamed, pointing their swords at the elf. But suddenly one soldier's sword broke in half. It was so fast and abrupt that no one understood how it happened. "Go ahead, dare," Ira added with a crazy look. She was very angry. The guards were abruptly frightened by such magic, and they fell to their knees, apologizing to the lady. The girl laughed sarcastically at their vaunted power. It seemed to her that they would hardly be able to achieve anything with such magic. "They lack faith in the Lord," said Iriel, watching the frightened army. Ira continued to mock the saint. calling her an unfortunate child since she believes that her abilities are granted by God and limits herself only to her faith in him. The saint did not like the elf's words, and she clenched her fist and prepared to strike. "You talk too much," she said and flew up to the lady. Ira confidently said the spell capture without making any unnecessary movements. The attacker was surrounded by magical chains, restricting her movements and preventing her from striking with magic. What is it like to feel the power of the Holy Empire being stopped by an ordinary elf? Ira continued to speak mockingly. Ariel bared her teeth and promised to show the full power of the Holy Empire. "I will do everything to take the saint with me, even if I have to cut him into pieces," she screamed madly. After her words, the forest trembled, and the birds flew away as far as possible. "Don't you dare say such things with your filthy mouth," threatened Lady Ariel, causing fear to appear in her eyes. "While you perceive him as just a piece of meat, you cannot even imagine how important he is to me," Ira stated firmly. "If I wanted," the girl's voice sounded very menacing and frightening. "She could easily wipe your entire race from the earth," the elf continued to scream, but Ray stopped her. "Didn't I tell you? I'm going to the Holy Empire," said the guy who had been watching the fight between the two girls all this time. The girl looked at the young man with displeasure, but Ariel was only pleased with this arrangement. But Ray had only one condition. "I will go to the Holy Empire, but I have conditions," the guy began to say. The saint was very surprised how the boy could set any conditions. "First, I will not be a saint for God's sake," he declared, to which Ariel immediately ran to him. The guy explained that he would become a saint because he wanted to, and that he would stop being one if he wanted to. The girl who ran up to him was very surprised by his words because how can one stop being a saint if you want to? "The second condition," Ray continued, raising his hand and showing the number 2 on his fingers. "If something like this happens again, I don't know what I'll do," the young man said menacingly. Ariel wondered what would happen then. "Who knows? Maybe I'll leave the Holy Empire and become a saint in an enemy country." Ray shrugged his shoulders, mocking the saint a little. Ariel immediately thought that he would then become a saint who had betrayed God, and then he would simply lose his strength. "Anything else?" the girl asked. "The third condition, give me access to all the libraries of the Holy Empire." The guy continued to voice his conditions. Ariel could, of course, easily fulfill the third request. "Fourth," Ray still raised his hand, pointing to the number 4 on his fingers. "I want to receive compensation for my work, clothes, food, housing. Will I have it?" the guy said. The saint did not particularly appreciate all of the above conditions, but Ray was always serious about money. Ariel had no choice but to accept this. "Saint, let's spit on all this." The servants have already started shouting, agitating that the position of a saint is not a reason to accept outrageous conditions. They didn't understand what kind of saint it was who wanted to be paid, and God simply made a mistake this time. The girl quickly stopped the servants from saying these words. "Of all the conditions you mentioned, except for the first, we can accept everything," the saint answered, realizing that there was no other way out. But Ray shrugged and explained that the first condition was the most important. The girl no longer believed what was happening and was very puzzled by his words. "The fifth condition," the guy suddenly added, and he ordered to apologize to the wounded Fia, who was sitting near the tree without strength. "Sincerely," Ray clarified. The guy asked Era to let Ariel go, and the girl, losing her balance, fell. "I can't do this," the saint said sullenly. "Please take into account my position as a saint fulfilling the will of God," Ariel answered almost with tears in her eyes. But the guy didn't care, because the position of the elves was also taken into account in the attention. The girl said that she had no other choice because he himself did not want to go with her. Ray asked again if she refused to apologize to the elf. Ariel answered clearly in agreement. "I can apologize if it is only my personal apology, but the responsibility that we bear is very heavy, and every word of mine can bring down the wrath of God," the saint brought to the attention. "Really? Okay then," Ray replied with a displeased tone of voice, and he ordered to finish with this and ask his God to find another saint. Ariel was very surprised because she almost managed to take the boy with her. "Let's go, Era. We need to take care of Fia," he called out to the lady, and both headed towards the wounded elf. "Wait, the girl stopped the two? Just a minute," she called out to the saint again, and she began to beg him to reconsider his decision because she could have prepared everything else. Ray turned around with an angry look and only threw after him that nothing else was needed, just an apology. Ariel was already starting to cry from hopelessness. "We're leaving, Ira," the guy called the girl, and, taking Fia on his shoulders, headed towards the village. "Is it okay for you to act like this?" the elf asked as they walked. The sunset had already appeared outside and the sun was getting ready to set. She still tried to persuade him that it was not too late to get everything back and that the Empire would come running at his mere call. I don't regret it at all if they can't apologize after what they've done, Ray said confidently. It seemed to him that it would be better not to follow them. The elf was wondering why someone like him would go so far for another race, to which the guy explained with a smile that he was doing what he wanted. And when asked what he wants, he answered in a calm tone, a happy life. Isn't that another reason to become a saint? Ira asked. Well, that would be nice. But getting irritated over trifles, helping the sick or wounded is not such a bad life either, the young man noted, still holding Fia on his back. He was not afraid to be happy in a small place. Ira looked kindly at the guy and added, You are truly one of a kind. The sun had already turned orange, indicating that sunset was near. At this time, Ariel stood in the middle of the forest edge where the battle was taking place. She recalled the boy's words that they should look for another saint. Perhaps she could not understand them. Holy lady, perhaps there has been some mistake? Asked one of the servants. The girl, very dejected, stood and thought over all the words, and taking off her cloak, she threw it on the ground. Come back. She briefly threw an order to her army. And I will go to the elven village, the saint declared, looking somewhere ahead. At the entrance to the village, there were 2 elf guards, discussing how Fia was doing, because she was very wounded. A figure dressed in a white suit appeared on their horizon and walked straight towards them. Stop, man, they shouted and forbade anyone to come closer. Ariel raised her hands and explained that she was not here to fight, but simply wanted to visit the saint who lived in this village. The elves did not understand what the girl was talking about. In any case, they could not let a person into the village and ordered him not to approach, otherwise it would be considered a threat to attack. In that case, could you please tell the saint that I will be waiting for him? Ariel asked with a bit of sincerity in her voice. The guards continued to insist on their own and did not let the saint in, telling her to go back where she came from. Please, let me at least stay here and wait, the girl begged, at least somehow convincing him that she was safe. She promised that she would not attack or cause any harm. The elves still took pity, but warned to stay on the spot. Otherwise, one wrong move could lead to trouble. Ariel bowed in gratitude, promising not to approach, and turning around, she went to wait for the boy. The saint she's talking about is Ray. The elves began to reason. At this time, the saint, looking for a place secluded from the bustle, went to a secluded place, hidden from everyone. She took off her shoes and dropped to her knees with ease, and closing her eyes as if renouncing the reality of the world, and crossing her arms on her chest, she began to offer a prayer to her God, entrusting herself to his mercy. A yellow light was pouring around her, and her lips whispered words of prayer directed towards the heavens. The elves wondered whether they should talk to the boy. The village continued to display festive decorations, but the atmosphere of celebration seemed to have passed like a passing breath of wind, leaving behind the sadness of recent events. Fia, bandaged and weakened, lay in bed, slowly returning to reality after the shock she had experienced. We managed to heal the serious wounds, Ray said, stretching after work. Now he can rest. Suddenly there was a knock on the door, breaking the silence of the evening. And when the guy went outside, he saw an elf who said that someone was looking for him right at the outskirts of the village. The guy immediately perked up and was surprised that the Holy Empire was still here and they hadn't surrendered. Ray clarified the number of those waiting for him, preparing to face the unknown. But hearing that only one young man did not understand anything at first. It was already dark outside, the moon had risen, and crickets were already sparkling in the forest. The boy came to his destination, where 2 elf guards stood. One of them immediately pounced on him with hugs and asked where the hero of the occasion had gone. What kind of person was looking for me? The guy asked, as if trying to distract himself from the annoying hugs. The elf pointed his hand towards Ariel. The girl was still kneeling and praying, radiating a bright light. Ray slowly walked towards her, preparing for any outcome. Hey, Saint, I heard you were looking for me, he called out to the girl, coming up almost right next to him. Don't even try. She's been like this since sunset, the guard explained. It seems like 3 hours have passed. The guy tensed up a little. He didn't understand what she was doing. Thinking that Ariel would soon wake up, I decided to just wait. Dusk turned to dawn, and the sky had already turned bright blue. A whole night had passed. The girl seemed to exhale all her fatigue, making it clear that her prayer had come to an end.